Good morning. Good morning. Morning. Good morning. Welcome. My name is Gary Wenbeck from Frank Church Institute. Welcome to the 30th America. Thank you. The first and former President Gerald Ford, and almost over. Before this election is finally over, you all need to vote. And today we have a large number of college and high school students present, and I just want a show of hands. How many of you are 18 or more? Terrific. All of you who are at least age 18 can register and vote today in the Ada County mobile voting unit, which is parked directly behind this building on the patio. All you need to be is an Ada County resident with a photo ID and proof of residency, and you can register and vote today between 9 a.m. and 3 p.m. So I hope you will take advantage of this opportunity. Let me introduce Dr. Corey Cook, the Dean of the School of Public Service at Boise State, where the Frank Church Institute is now part of the Global Studies program. Our thanks to Dean Cook and to the many contributors to the Frank and Bethine Church Chair of Public Affairs, which now has a national search underway for a holder of the chair. Dr. Cook.
Hi, good morning. My name is Corey Cook. I'm the Dean of the School of Public Service. As Gary mentioned, the School of Public Service was created a year ago, really with two goals in mind. One is to inspire and equip students for lives and careers of ethical and effective public service. We run a range of programs in our school. As Gary mentioned, we're starting a new global studies program. We'll have the first endowed chair in the School of Public Service. We're hiring right now for a faculty member who will serve as the Frank and Bethine Church Chair in the Global Studies program that we will be creating this year. We're starting a new Urban Studies program, as well as we have existing programs in environmental studies, in political science, and in criminal justice. In addition, we have graduate programs. Just yesterday, the school awarded its first PhD in public policy. We'll be obviously awarding the PhD at graduation. We had our first successful dissertation defense. So for the first time in the history of this university, we're awarding a PhD in public policy. It's kind of a big deal. So I want to start by thanking the board of the Frank Church Institute. A lot of time and a lot of energy has gone into planning this conference today. If I could ask members of the board of the Frank Church Institute to please stand and be acknowledged. We're grateful to the board for all their work, not only in planning this conference, but in supporting the Frank Church Chair and supporting the Frank Church Scholarship Program. As Gary mentioned, the focus of this year's conference is the presidential election. As many of you are aware, typically the third presidential debate is the one that focuses on foreign policy. That happened again this year. You may remember the question that started, we only have about 30 seconds left, but maybe we should talk about foreign policy now. That's when it was covered. So the hope today is that we can delve into some of the issues that maybe we've been missing out on while talking about other things. Obviously, this is an important election for the young people in the room. A lot of people predicted this election would be about foreign policy. This was probably 18 months ago before we got the candidates that we got. But the sense was it would be an opportunity for us to talk about the enormous challenges that are happening across the globe, and instead it's turned into maybe one of the most divisive and darkest elections, certainly in my lifetime. So the hope is today we can convene a group of folks. We have interesting scholars, practitioners, I think a really good lineup of people today to speak with you and have a conversation that may be missing on the national scale. So again, I really appreciate you being here. It is my great honor to introduce our next speaker. Lauren McLean is the president of the Boise City Council. She is a graduate of Notre Dame University and has a MPA from Boise State University. She's one of our alums, and we're enormously proud of the impact that she has in the city and across the Treasure Valley. So with that, Councilwoman McLean.
Good morning, everybody. So first off, Corey, I just do need to correct you. I'm not the president of the City Council. Lest Elaine Clegg be here or worry, I should give her her due. I am the vice president, or as we say in Latin, president pro tempore, president at the moment, for the Boise City Council. But thank you all. I want to wish everybody a very good morning. Welcome you to the Frank Church Institute Conference. And also for those of you that are visiting, welcome you to Boise on behalf of the mayor and the city council. It's a particular honor to welcome Congressman Davis and Frost to Boise. And I wanted to say that I had read first that you were both leaders at a time when Washington worked, when people across the aisle from each other worked together when it was time. But this morning I had a conversation with a friend and colleague in Washington, D.C. who said the same thing but more. And I was told that you were both still known and respected for the time you were political adversaries as the heads of the campaign units for both the Republicans and the Democrats in Congress. And you were effective legislators, smart strategists, and although you worked on different sides, you laid down your arms and worked together when you needed to for the good of our country. And that's what we need to see more of in D.C. today. So I'm just going to say that, here I am. Those were the days that I was in high school and watched all this remotely. So it doesn't seem really fair that I say those were the days. But I feel like so much of what we're seeing in this election, we saw in my first election in high school, which was the Clinton-Perot-Bush election. But it reminds me of stories that I heard from Bethine Church herself. And I'm going to tell you a story about Bethine. The summer that I was lucky enough to work for her. And it was also the summer that she was writing her memoir. So I would field phone calls from people that I just read about in high school history books that wanted to talk with Bethine and share stories with her. But she'd tell me of the time that she and Frank had in D.C., where the wives would socialize together regardless of party, the kids would play together, and it was a really different place than it's been since I've been an adult in politics. And I didn't know Frank, but I knew Bethine well. And I have to say that when I first met her, I was absolutely terrified of her. I'd heard that she was exacting. She expected excellence. She was really such a strong partner to Senator Frank Church when he was in office, and before that too. But then as I got to know her, the more I realized and felt that I loved her and she loved people and would always work and fight for the people that she cared about, and no matter how tough she seemed. And this was echoed, and this is the story I wanted to share with you. When I met Vice President Biden at a private reception a couple years ago, and I was so nervous to meet him, and I really didn't want to get in line to meet him because I was so nervous. And the people that I was with said, no, just push your way up there and say hello and introduce yourself. And so they kind of pushed me up there because I couldn't push myself up there. And he zeroed in on my name tag and said, Lauren McLean from Idaho, which of course left me dumbfounded because I couldn't figure out how he knew who I was. I'd forgotten about my name tag. And he said, I want to tell you about Bethine. He said, when I was in the Senate, there was nobody that was more of a family to me than Bethine and Frank and their children. He's like, and Bethine in particular had a heart of gold and was tough as nails. And it was just, and then he said Idaho always had a special place in his heart because of the relationship and the place in his heart that Bethune had. And I've always, every time I think of him and think of her, I think of that story because it says so much about the senator and Bethune as a couple, but also as advocates for our state and the impact they had. And today I have to say that while back in the day the wives socialized in DC, today it's the wives that make the amazing senators. And so to those of you here that are young and thinking about your future, we need to see more of you girls and young women leading us both here locally and nationally, because I think that we would see such a different politic and a different language than we see right now when more women are in charge. So I'm going to make that plug for all of you in the room. And I have a daughter at Boise High who is a junior, so I wanted to take her out of school today to hear this, but I decided she should probably stay in school. But I tell her the same thing, and I also tell my son the same thing, that the more women that are in charge and the more men backing them, the better off we will all be. And so finally, I want to say something about the theme today, which I think is so fascinating because it's something I've thought about since I was in college. And it's politics and prose, America votes. And I really think, and this gives heed to it, that language is so important to law, politics, and civil society. And as a kid, I studied a lot of foreign languages, not really thinking about the importance of the language that I chose in my own native language when it came to things I cared about. And it was really fun to think about the kind of idiomatic sayings of the Greeks and the French and the Italians and the Russians and how that all, what it really meant when you were solving this puzzle of language. And ultimately, when I was in college, I came out to the American West for a summer policy program in Montana, I realized that there was the same puzzle of language in the American language and the English language that I'd never really thought about. And somebody I started reading, Charlie Wilkinson, he's a law professor at the University of Colorado at Boulder, wrote in the 90s when I was in Montana about the power of language in law. But it also has stuck with me because I think it's not just writing of law, but it's in how we talk about the issues that we're advocating for, how we bring people together to take action on those issues, and ultimately how we pass policy to change the course of our nation or our city. And he makes the case that the language ought to mirror the loftiness of our ideals and values. And actually, in his book, he called out the Wilderness Act that Senator Church was the sponsor of as being the one instance in environmental law where values and loftiness of vision actually found its way into the writing of the law itself. But he asked this question in a book he wrote called Mapping a New West. And he asks, is language the ultimate answer? Not remotely. Is language a sound, constructive, and necessary beginning? Absolutely. In our society, we set the essential context for action through our language. And by that language, we invite inquiry by the human imagination, or we clamp down on imaginative inquiry. We set a high tone, or we opt for business as usual. And I'd go on to say that today we're not opting for business as usual, but our language has dropped the game, the whole thing even lower. So back in '92, before I'd say politics took a turn for the worse, Professor Wilkinson wished we could move quickly to elevate the language of law and politics and the actions of public officials. He believed in 1992 that it would take a generation. And that means it's on us, my generation, that was high schoolers at the time he wrote this, and yours, all of you Boise State students and Boise High students, as you move into your future careers. And I really am going to urge you that you think about that and you attempt to do it. And I think that conversations like the one we'll have today are a good start, but more importantly, it's the conviction that you take away from it and the action that you choose to jump into afterwards that I hope will come from today that will help us change politics and voting and election and the course of not only our local community but national community over time. So thank you and welcome, and enjoy the morning.
So to set the stage this morning, our opening speaker is Dr. Cornell Clayton. Dr. Clayton is the director of the Thomas S. Foley Institute of Public Policy at Washington State University. He also serves as the Thomas S. Foley Distinguished Professor of Government. He's written widely about American government, politics, and law, and his topic today is American Rage, Division and Anger in U.S. Politics. Dr. Clayton.
Thanks, and thanks for having me here. This is a great group. You should have a wonderful conference after this first speaker's finished, because you have a great lineup later. What I want to do today is three things. First of all, I want to talk a little bit about what we call the incivility crisis we have in our politics today, and try to put that into a broader historical context. Secondly, I want to talk a little bit about why we're seeing an uptick in incivility today, and talk a little bit about political polarization, the nature of our divides in America today. And then finally, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the relationship between civility and civil discourse and democratic institutions. And I'll just say that this relationship is more complicated than most people assume. I'm going to talk a little bit about something I call the democratic manner, which is a set of habits of thought that people need to have in order for democracy to function properly. Let me begin with a caveat, and the caveat's this. Incivility in politics is hardly new. It's been around a long time. Some of you may know that William Gladstone and Benjamin Disraeli were two fierce rivals in 19th century British politics. On one occasion, Gladstone got up and said, "Disraeli is an unprincipled maniac who will die either by hanging or of some vile disease." To which Disraeli immediately got up and responded. He says, "That all depends, sir, upon whether I embrace your principles or your mistresses." So that's pretty uncivil, but at least it's humorous, it's clever, it's imaginative. Unlike a lot of the incivility we see in our politics today, which is simply crass, base, oftentimes mind-numbingly repetitive. We paint each other's opponents up in Joker face. I would have a lot less heartburn with incivility, I think, if it was a little more clever, a little more humorous, a little more imaginative today. Here's what we can agree about. We're surrounded by political incivility, from members of Congress who yell out, "You lie," to the President of the United States during his speech to Congress, to radio talk show hosts who call young ladies sluts on the air because they disagree over health care policy, to individuals who show up at political rallies armed with guns and get in fist fights. It's everywhere. The real question isn't whether or not we have incivility in our politics, it's whether it's really substantively different than in the past, and whether or not it is a threat to our democracy. Just by show of hands, how many think it has gotten really bad and it is a threat to our democracy? Okay, almost all of you. You're probably not going to be heartened to hear that as bad as our civil discourse is today, it has been worse, a lot worse in the past. So let me talk a little bit about some previous periods of incivility in our politics. The founding era, a period we often mythologize. We often talk about our founding fathers in reverential terms. Certainly they could not have been uncivil to each other. And yet the election of 1800 is probably the nastiest in all of American political history. Typical of the campaign in 1800 are these two political cartoons. The one on the left there depicts Thomas Jefferson in the embrace of Satan, pulling down the pillars of good government. That's a suggestive embrace that was not by accident, by the way. The one on the right depicts Thomas Jefferson as a cock in the hen house. The hen there is Sally Hemings, his slave with whom he was having an illicit affair. This is tough stuff. Of course, back then, the newspapers were not independent media organs like they are today. They were, in fact, partisan organs. They were used to propagate the cause for one party and attack the other party. If you simply took what those partisan newspapers wrote about their opponents and put them in the form of today's political campaign ads, this is what it would sound like.
John Adams is a blind, bald, crippled, toothless man who wants to start a war with France. While he's not busy importing mistresses from Europe, he's trying to marry one of his sons to a daughter of King George. Haven't we had enough monarchy in America?
I'm Thomas Jefferson, and I approve this message because John Adams is a hideous, hermaphroditical character with neither the force and firmness of a man nor the gentleness and sensibility of a woman.
If Thomas Jefferson wins, murder, robbery, rape, adultery, and incest will be openly taught and practiced. The air will be rent with the cries of the distressed, the soil will be soaked with blood, and the nation black with crimes. Are you prepared to see your dwellings in flames, female chastity violated, children writhing on a pike?
I'm John Adams, and I approve this message because Jefferson is the son of a half-breed Indian squaw raised on hoe cakes, and Hamilton is a Creole bastard brat of a Scotch peddler.
The nastiest, most negative election.
Well, thanks to the people at Real TV, you have an idea of how nasty and ugly that campaign was. In fact, it was so nasty and ugly that Adams and Jefferson didn't speak to each other for another 20 years afterwards. They were good friends during the Revolutionary War. This is a period that ends with two other towering political figures, Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr, so enraged with each other they engage in a duel in which Alexander Hamilton is shot dead. 1820 is another period of ugly, nasty division in our politics. Andrew Jackson was often depicted as a sort of a country bumpkin and ignorant, and he was called so often a dumbass or a jackass that he eventually adopted that moniker for himself, which is why the Democratic Party to this day is symbolized by the donkey. Adams, for his part, was often called a tyrant and a pimp. The pimp charge came from when he was our ambassador to Russia. He was accused of supplying American virgins to the Tsar. Of course, it was not true, but that didn't keep his political opponents from making that charge. 1890s, the build-up to the Civil War, the 1850s and 1860s, obviously the most violent and ugly period in American political history. Probably the most infamous event to occur in the U.S. Congress occurred when Preston Brooks of South Carolina became so enraged at Charles Sumner's speech against the Fugitive Slave Act, he went to the Senate floor and beat him into unconsciousness with his cane. Abraham Lincoln, of course, was the subject of the most venomous attacks, obviously in the South, but also in the Copperhead Press of the North. Here's an editorial from a Wisconsin newspaper that wrote, "Mr. Lincoln is a fungus from the corrupt womb of bigotry and fanaticism. The man who votes for Lincoln now is a traitor and murderer. If he is elected to misgovern for another 4 years, we trust some bold hand will pierce his heart with dagger point for the public good." I've seen a lot of tough things written about our presidents lately. I have yet to see a major newspaper editorialize that he should be assassinated, and of course, Lincoln was assassinated. 1880s, 1890s, a period that political historians often call the period of no decision. It's because our politics was so closely divided that control of the presidency and Congress alternated back and forth between the parties. No party dominated this period. This is a period that begins with things like the Haymarket riot in the 1880s, where several protesters are shot protesting for workers' rights. It culminates in two elections between William Jennings Bryan and William McKinley. Bryant was often depicted as a religious fanatic, a crazy person. McKinley was often depicted as a stooge of corporate power. You see that cartoon in the corner there. He's in the palm of big business, and there's a cufflink there, his skull, it says labor across it. Another period that ends in political violence with the assassination of William McKinley in 1901 by a steel worker who thought that the Republican Party was to blame for him losing his job. 1930s. President Franklin Roosevelt was called every name in the book: a dictator, a fascist, a communist, a Marxist, a traitor to our country. Of course, this is a period when today's radio, the bombastic radio talk show hosts we have today, they had their forerunner in Father Charles Coughlin, who had a weekly radio broadcast that he would use to inveigh against the president, oftentimes using anti-Semitic slurs. And of course, many of us in this room, not a lot of you young people, but some of us older people, remember the 1960s. period that begins with the incivility shown to peaceful civil rights protesters in the South. It culminates in the violent anti-war protests where students and other protesters are shot and killed at places like Kent State. It's a period where our political parties like the Black Panther Party become militarized. And of course we have the assassination of three of our towering political figures of the 20th century, John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King. So, less civil today? Certainly not. But these are not normal periods in American political history either. All of these are periods that political scientists often equate with or associate with what we call critical election periods, which are periods where you see tectonic shifts in party structures. New parties emerge, like the Democratic Party in the 1820s, the Republican Party in the 1860s, or existing parties fundamentally reform themselves, like the New Deal Democratic Party did in the 1930s, the New Right Republican Party did, beginning in the 1960s and leading up to the 1980s. These are also periods often associated with mass social movements and enfranchisement of new Americans. So people who didn't own property in the 1820s, the newly freed slaves in the Civil War period, the women's suffrage movement around the turn of the century, and of course the fight for greater inclusion of women and minorities in American public life in the 1960s. This is all to say that incivility is a symptom and not a cause of deep divisions in the body politic. Which makes sense. We get more passionate and we care a lot more about our politics when our politics matters the most, when we are deeply divided. I think one of the confusions that people have, and I sometimes call them the civility boosters, I'm all in favor of civility. But simply being nicer to each other is probably not going to resolve our deep divisions. It gets the causality wrong. So let me spend a little bit of time now talking about the way we are divided today and how we should understand how that's driving some of the incivility. And here's what we know as a fact. Our elected officials are more polarized today than any period in over a century, in fact, in any period since we've had these two particular political parties. So how do I know that? Well, the answer is political scientists don't have a lot to do. And so a group of political scientists led by Nolan McCarthy out of Princeton University, they went back and they studied every single roll call vote ever cast in the U.S. Congress. And on the basis of those roll call votes, they could place every member of Congress on a continuum of liberal to conservative in terms of their voting record. So if you look at that chart on the left there, on the vertical axis, you have the ideological continuum. So a positive score is a conservative voting record, a negative score is a liberal voting record, and then they simply took the median Democratic member of the House and the median Republican member of the House, and they chart them over time. So that chart goes from 1944 to 2010, and you can see that the median Republican always voted more conservatively than the median Democrat did. But what I really want you to pay attention to is what happens around 1980 or so, late 1970s, early 1980s, and that gap begins to grow enormously. In fact, it's twice as wide today as it was in 1980. Now, another way of saying this is that our elected officials, our members of Congress, are twice as less likely to vote across party lines today as they were in 1980. Democrats with Republicans, Republicans with Democrats. So if you simply measure that distance between the median Democratic and median Republican member of the chamber, you get what we call the polarization index, and that's what the chart does on the right. That's the polarization index for both the U.S. House and the U.S. Senate. The Senate is blue and the House is the red measure there. And that chart goes all the way back to 1877 up through 2013. And you can see both the House and the Senate are more polarized than they've ever been since we've had these two particular political parties. Now, not only are elected officials polarized, they are also what we call sorted, ideologically sorted into tribal-like teams or camps. So this is the same data using that voting records from members of Congress, simply arranges it into density bar charts. And so if you look at the one on the right there, that's the voting records of members of the House back in the 87th House of Representatives, which was in 1961 to 1962. And each one of those bars tells you how many members would have fallen along the ideological continuum, which is now at the horizontal axis. So again, a negative score there reflects a liberal voting record, and a positive score there reflects a conservative voting record. And you can see each of those bars tells you how many members. So, that high bar, the blue one there, is about 42 members, 43 members of the Democratic Party, members of Congress who were Democrats who would have voted along that point in the ideological continuum. Now, the chart on the right is the last completed Congress, the 112th Congress. This is 2011 to 2013. Now, I want you to notice something about these two charts. The first is both parties have pulled away from the centers. Republicans have moved further away from the center than the Democrats have. We call that asymmetrical polarization, but both have pulled away from the center. But what I really want you to notice is what's happening in the middle there. If you went back to the 1960s, and I asked you, are Democrats liberal and are Republicans conservative? Your answer then would have been very different than it is today. And the reason is because back then, both parties were ideologically heterogeneous. Both parties had liberals and conservatives. The Democratic Party had a lot of liberals, primarily found in the Northeast, but they also had this huge part of their party called the Southern Democrats, the Dixiecrats. They were extremely conservative, more conservative than many Republicans. Same thing on the Republican side. There are a lot of conservative Republicans found primarily out west here, people like Ronald Reagan and Barry Goldwater. But they also had a very liberal wing. We called it the Rockefeller wing, found primarily in the Northeast. And they were more liberal than many Democrats. That's those overlapping bars on the first chart. Those were the Dixiecrats and the Rockefeller Republicans. Democrats who were more liberal than, or more conservative than many Republicans. Republicans who were more liberal than many Democrats. Look what's happening today. Zero overlap. What this tells us, there's not a single member in the House today who's a Republican who votes more liberally than any of the Democrats. Not a single member in the House today who's a Democrat who votes more conservatively than any of the Republicans. We've sorted ourselves out into these ideologically tribal-like teams. Now, if that's what's going on with our elected officials, there's a question, is that also what's going on with the American public? Are we deeply divided into red and blue America, as we're often told? And that's what this little funny thing shows. Supposedly there's a red America out there that's deeply, about religious values, and they go to NASCAR and they wave the flag all the time. And there's this blue America, a bunch of snobs who are overeducated, drinking Chardonnay and going to operas. We're deeply divided along this cultural divide in America, we're told. And there's some truth to that. It's way oversimplified, and I won't go into that right now. But it is true that we are increasingly divided as a public as well. This is simply data from the Pew Survey on Values. They do this every year. They ask 47 separate questions about morals and values. Questions like, do you believe members of the same sex should be allowed to marry? Do you believe there should be prayer in public schools? Do you believe women should have access to abortion? And then they simply tally up how self-identified Republicans versus self-identified Democrats respond to these questions, and this is the gap between the two. So if you went back to 1987, the gap between the two was about 9 or 10 percentage points. Today, in fact, the most recent one, it's about 20 percentage points. It's doubled during that period. How Democrats versus Republicans think about these issues has grown enormously during this period. Now, how do I know that this is a result of partisanship and party politics? Well, the way I know that is because we can control for other factors. So this shows you the gap between how different members of different races, different education levels, people with high education levels, lower education levels, different income levels, different levels of religiosity, how often do you go to a house of worship or do you go at all, and different genders respond to these. And there's a gap in all of these. Men and women think differently about these issues. People who are more religious think differently about these issues than people who are less religious. But notice that the gap in all these other areas has remained almost constant through this period. The only place where the gap has grown is with respect to partisanship. And what this tells us is that our partisan identities, our social identities, is what's driving this divide in how we think about these issues. Now, it's not just moral values questions. The National Election Survey, which is the oldest and largest survey of American political attitudes, they ask questions along a whole host of policy fronts, including race relations, including how do you think about the role of the government in terms of the private sector and regulation, how do you think about social welfare programs, and in all those, that's the chart on the left there, in all these areas, the gap between how Democrats and Republicans think about these issues has grown enormously during this period. In fact, the chart on the right is simply the correlation between whether or not you identify yourself as a Democrat or a Republican and whether or not you identify yourself as conservative or liberal. And you'll notice if you went back to the 1970s, that correlation was only about 0.3. That is not a strong correlation at all. It doesn't explain very much of the variation. Today, it's about 0.75, an extremely strong correlation. In fact, if all I know about you is whether you are a Democrat or Republican, I can predict how you will think and vote on a whole host of policy issues today. So we have also become more polarized and also sorted ourselves out into these ideologically monolithic, tribal-like teams or camps. Now, why is this so important? The reason this is so important is because it leads to what we call affective polarization. And what I mean by that is simply how do we feel about each other? So this is from the National Election Survey again. They ask a whole set of questions they call thermometer questions on a scale of 0 to 100, with 0 being very negative, 100 being very positive. How do you feel about blank? And then they put different things in the blank, and it can be how do you feel about Republicans in Congress? How do you feel about President Obama? How do you feel about the leaders of Iran? How do you feel about members of your immediate family? How do you feel about cockroaches? That was actually a question they used once as a test question. So this is feelings about partisanship. Top two lines is how partisans feel about their own party. How do Democrats feel about the Democratic Party? The Republicans feel about the Republican Party. And you can see we feel pretty warm and fuzzy about our party. Almost 80 points on a 100-point scale. That's higher, by the way, than how we feel about members of our immediate family. We like our parties better than we like members of our immediate family, which makes sense because we don't oftentimes get to choose who's in our immediate family. The bottom two lines is how do we feel about the other party? How do Democrats feel about Republicans and Republicans feel about Democrats? 18 points on a 100-point scale today. That's lower than the cockroach scored. We loathe the other party. Now, what I really want you to notice, if you went back to the 1970s, we didn't like the other party as much as our own party. We've always liked our own party better than the other party. We didn't hate the other party. 45 on a 100-point scale. If it was 50, that would be the indifference point. We liked our party. We were indifferent towards the other party. Today, we hate the other party. Not only do we loathe the other party, we increasingly see them as a threat. Again, from Pew data. This simply asks, do you think that the other party's policies are so misguided that they pose a threat to our nation's well-being? 27% of all Democrats think that of the Republicans. 36% of all Republicans think that of the Democratic Party. If you look at Democrats who are consistently liberal in their political views, 50% of them, 1 in 2, think the Republican Party is not just wrong, but a threat to the nation's well-being. 66% of Republicans, 2/3 of Republicans who are consistently conservative in their views, think the Democratic Party is an actual threat to our nation's well-being. That's what we mean by affective polarization. Now, one final way we're divided. It's very important, doesn't get discussed enough. Not only are we polarized, sorted out into these tribal-like ideological camps, which increasingly forces us to start thinking about the other side as loathe them and to think of them as a threat, but we are also closely divided. And we've been more closely divided for a longer period than probably any point in American political history. So this is simply the vote margin in presidential elections going back to the turn of the century. The first bar there is Teddy Roosevelt's election going up through Barack Obama's two most recent elections. All I want you to note here is that if you look out through most of the 20th century, Presidential elections were decided by 15, 20, 25 percentage points. Look what's happened over the last 30 plus years. Not a single election has been decided by more than 8 percentage points. Most of them much closer than that. In fact, in 2000, we had our first election in over a century when the president who won the Electoral College lost the popular vote. And this is not just going on in presidential elections. My friend Frances Lee, she went back and she actually looked at all votes cast for all federal offices. So votes cast for the presidency, but also for all House seats and for all Senate seats. She then tallied them up, how many votes cast for Republicans, how many votes cast for Democrats, and aggregated them by decade. So each of these bars here reflects an entire decade of votes for all federal offices, and the difference between how many were cast for Democrats versus Republicans. So the red bars are decades where the Republicans dominated our electoral system. So you go back to 1860, that's that first bar. Republicans got about 23% more votes than Democratic candidates did. Blue bars are decades where the Democrats dominated. But I want you to look at the very end there, 3 little purple bars. Those are decades where the difference, the total difference in the number of votes cast for all Democrats and all Republicans is less than 2 percentage points. The only time that's happened, the last 3 decades and back in 1880. Another period of very close division, which I talked about a bit earlier. Well, what does that mean? Well, what that means is we often end up with divided government as a result of how closely divided we are. This is simply every election going back to 1980, both midterms and presidential elections, and which party controlled each of the 3 electoral institutions in our federal government, the House, the Senate, and the presidency. So ours represent Republican control, these represent Democratic control. And what I want you to note here, I'm sorry, the colors you might not be able to see very well, but there is no pattern. No party has controlled one institution or all 3 institutions for an extended period of time. And what this means is we are now deeply polarized. We're sorted in these ideological, tribal-like camps. And now you put one party in charge of the presidency and another party in charge of Congress, or one party in charge of the House and another party in charge of the Senate. And we expect them to cooperate. It's not going to happen. And that's what leads to the gridlock that so frustrates Americans. It's not that we're polarized necessarily. It's not even that we're sorted into ideologically coherent parties. In fact, that's a good thing for democracy in many ways. What you want in a democracy are parties that represent distinct and clear views and present those to the voters, and the voters can choose. The problem is we're so closely divided as well. Now, I mentioned there's one real historic parallel to today. It was the 1880s, 1890s. This is the pattern of partisan control institutions during that period. You can see it's similar in terms of there's no pattern at all. And I think what is striking, these patterns of partisanship in America, they don't come out of nowhere. What underlies them are real issues that divide us as Americans. And what is striking is how similar the issues are today as what they were in the 1880s and 1890s. Both periods are marked by massive economic transformations. Back then it was the nationalization of the economy. Today it's the globalization of the economy. Both of these tremendously shift the way we work, the way we earn our livelihoods, the way we support our families. And we're deeply divided about how to respond to this. Both periods are marked by rising economic inequality. That was the first Gilded Age. Today, we are living in the new Gilded Age. Wealth and income are more polarized today than they've been at any time since the turn of the century. Both periods are marked by massive immigration and demographic shifts. We have more foreign-born Americans today than we've had at any time since the 1890s. Now, immigrants bring dynamism to our economy, to our culture, but they also raise deep issues about identity, conflict. We are divided over how to respond to these issues. Both periods, you see real changes in the way we run our campaigns and elections. That's the first period where you saw massive amounts of money starting to pour into campaigns, and we worried about it back then and tried to get it out. Today we have massive amounts of money again pouring into our campaigns. That's the first time you saw voter registration restrictions used to weed out undesirable voters. You see the emergence of voter registration again as an effort to try to suppress the vote on the part of some people. So, this is what leads to incivility in our politics. We are deeply divided as a country. We have real issues, and the parties represent completely different views about how we should respond to these issues. I want you to just think about two recent elections. The election in 2000. 105 million votes cast. If less than 1,000 had gone the other way in Florida, George Bush would not have become president, and if George Bush had not become president, we would not have gone into Iraq. We would not have had the Iraq War. Jump ahead to 2008. Out of the 125 million votes cast, if 1,000 had gone the other way, in any number of states where you had extremely close Senate elections and Democrats were elected, Democrats would not have had the 60-seat majority they needed to pass the ACA or Obamacare. We would not have had Obamacare. Now, my point isn't that the Iraq War or Obamacare are good or bad policies. But these are policies that will fundamentally shape American society for a generation or more. They're being decided by a handful of votes. It is not irrational for people to get passionate about their politics today. That's why you see the uptick in incivility. So, let me turn to the last part of my talk today. What is the relationship between this incivility and democracy? Is it really a threat to our democracy? And again, I think it's a little more complicated than some people suggest. Certainly, there are some forms of incivility that are undemocratic. Violence, threats, intimidation, obviously that's undemocratic. But there's a lot of incivility that's not only not undemocratic, we actually sometimes think of it as actually fostering or promoting democracy. So look on the left there. That's the first Tea Party. That was certainly uncivil. Yet we think of it as advancing democracy. The women's suffragettes. They were considered uncivil merely for speaking out publicly about politics at a time when women were not supposed to speak about politics. The modern civil rights movement. Certainly raising your fist at the Olympics. Violation of our norms, our customs, our traditions, that was considered uncivil by many Americans. But today we think of that as advancing a democratic cause. I got Colin Kaepernick there. A lot of people think what he's doing is uncivil. But he might also be advancing an argument, a democratic argument, about certain people in our country and their exclusion. So, when is incivility a threat to our democracy, and when is it simply part of the give and take? The conflict that is democracy. Democracy is about conflict. It's about resolving conflictual problems. And oftentimes the byproduct of that is rudeness, incivility. So when is it a threat to democracy and when is it not? To understand that, I think we have to understand a little bit about what we mean by a commitment to democracy. I like Winston Churchill's quote. It says, "Democracy is the absolute worst form of government except for all others that have been tried from time to time." Now, what do you mean by that? What he meant by that is, look, if you want to get the right outcomes, the right policies, democracy's awful. It often gets it wrong. Simply because 51% of us want something doesn't mean it's right. The great virtue of democracy, Churchill said, however, is it's self-correcting. You can get it wrong this time, and we can vote those scoundrels out the next time. Unlike other systems of government, it can correct itself. Now, what this means is democracy is a commitment to a process, not an outcome. It has to be. We can't be committed to democracy only when we get the outcome we want. If that were the case, about 50% of Americans would want to junk democracy after each election. So once we understand that, we understand there's certain habits of thought you have to have for a democracy to function. I call these the manners of democracy. And I steal this from Stephen Carter, who actually wrote a great book called Civility several years ago. Requires a certain attitude or way of thought on the part of an individual deeply and passionately about, but still reaffirm your respect and bond of citizenship to those with whom you disagree. It's an attitude we have to have, not towards those who we agree with. Attitude we have to have towards those whom we disagree with deeply. To recognize their common citizenship, respect them, and their views. We could disagree with them, but they have right views, and they're equally legitimate as our own. What types of incivility threaten that democratic manner? In which do not. We know that's undemocratic. Debate, and what I mean by this is we have lots of honest disagreements with each other, but in every election cycle you will see dishonest debate for alternative political gains. Last election, on the left there is an ad the Obama campaign against Mitt Romney in which they claimed he was a big outsourcer of jobs. Every fact-checking organization looked at this and said, just not true. No fact behind this. But the Obama campaign, and knew that, they continued to run these because it played didn't care about American workers. The said against Obama, saying that he didn't support work for welfare. Every fact-checking organization looked at this, said just dead wrong, no factual basis for this. The Romney campaign knew that. They continued to run the ad anyways because it played into the narrative they wanted to portray as President Obama giving away free stuff to people, as Mitt Romney once said. Well, why? First of all, why is that uncivil? Obviously, it's uncivil to lie about the other person and what they really believe and what their real positions are. But it's undemocratic because it prevents us from having honest debate with each other. It prevents us from really tackling what it is that divides us. Delegitimizing or questioning the other's loyalty. It can't be that simply because I disagree with you, you all somehow become un-American. You have to respect the other person's legitimacy, their citizenship, if we want to live in a democracy, even when you disagree with them deeply. Tribal-like thinking, uncritical thinking. What I mean by this is simply knee-jerk responses. Being against a position simply because the other side has taken that position. And again, we see this quite frequently. I'll give you a couple of quick examples. My favorite one on the Republican side is Obamacare. We know Republicans hate Obamacare, right? They voted now, I don't know, 67 times to try to defund Obamacare. Every Republican's against it. They all want to get rid of it. It was a Republican idea. It came out of the Heritage Foundation in the 1980s. It is exactly what Bob Dole proposed as a response to Hillary Clinton's proposals to reform health care in the early 1990s. That's why Mitt Romney, as a Republican governor, adopted it. It's a free market response. It was the idea you keep the private health insurance companies intact. You require all Americans to buy health insurance from them. That's a free market response to the health care crisis in America. Republicans love this idea. Democrats hated the idea. They wanted a single-payer system. Obama couldn't get it. He couldn't get all of his Democrats to vote for that. So he adopted the Republican model. And as soon as he did, they hated it. They hated it. Example on the Democratic side, the NSA surveillance program. When we first learned about this back in the 1990s, early 1990s, or excuse me, in the early 2000s, George Bush was the president. 2/3 of Democrats said this was an illegitimate program. Their heads were spinning around. This is a violation of our constitutional rights. Today, same program still in place, but our president now is Obama. And now 2/3 of Democrats say it's just fine. It's flip-flopped. One final example here. Global warming. Is there scientific evidence of man-made global warming? Well, what's the answer to that? Well, science. Science doesn't care what you are or what your identity is. So it shouldn't matter whether you're a Democrat or Republican. So why is it that consistently 80 to 90% of Democrats think there's scientific evidence for global warming and less than 50% of Republicans do? Tribal-like thinking. We come to our political attitudes not like we're solving math problems. We come to our political attitudes through our social identities. We believe our camp, our team, our tribe. And that's how we form most of our political beliefs. So one final thing, and then I'll finish up here. I get this from John Rawls, who's one of our most powerful and influential political philosophers who recently passed away in this country. He said, in a country like ours, a democracy like ours, which is different than many democracies, we are a pluralist democracy, meaning we have, from the very beginning of our country, been a country composed not of a people or of a religion. We're composed of many peoples, many races, many ethnicities, many cultures, many religions. We are a pluralist democracy. In that kind of democracy, we have a special duty of civility to each other. And that is not to appeal to strictly sectarian arguments when we engage each other in our political debates. Look, if I tell you you should vote a certain way, support a certain set of policies or a certain candidate because God tells you so, how do you respond to me? You can't. When we engage each other as citizens, we have to do it on the basis of public reasons, reasons we can all agree to, and not use our strictly sectarian views. These should be very powerful in our own lives, but they cannot form a basis for democratic debate in pluralist democracies. So, here's what I've argued. First of all, political incivility increases in periods of polarization and close division. That's what we are again today. Probably more closely divided for a longer period than we've been in any point in American history. Polarized and ideologically sorted parties are not necessarily a threat to democracy. In many ways, they are healthy for democracies. The problem comes when you overlay on top of those close division. That's what produces the gridlock that so frustrates Americans. Thirdly, I've argued that incivility is a natural byproduct of deep division in democratic politics, and most of it is, we shouldn't be that concerned about it. At times, of course, it can be undemocratic. Threats, intimidation, challenging or threatening or delegitimizing the other side, all of those I think we should be concerned about. We should be concerned about incivility when it keeps us from engaging in open, honest debate. And then finally, I've argued that the reason we have incivility today is because we are deeply divided, not vice versa. We're not going to solve these divisions by simply being nicer to each other. The reason why we see some incivility is because we deeply disagree about how to respond to some major challenges that confront our country. And so we might do better off focusing on those challenges rather than the style of our debate and personalities in our debate. All right, I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
All right, while the panel is gathering here, let me introduce the chairman of the panel, and he'll introduce our panelists. The first panel this morning is titled The Partisan Divide and Congress in Crisis. And that happens to be the title of a book written by Congressman Frost and Davis that's for sale in the lobby. The book includes an introduction by David Eisenhower, the grandson of the president and a historian, who states, "This is the most significant political book I have read in a decade. so I hope you'll consider buying a copy. The panel will be moderated by former Congressman Larry LaRocco, member of the Board of Directors of the Frank Church Institute, and among his many roles, Larry is past president of the former members of Congress. Larry.
Well, thanks, Gary. It's my great pleasure to be with you today, and I'll be moderating this panel, although I don't think that's going to be a heavy lift for me because our two guests today know each other very well, and they look forward to taking your questions after they make their brief remarks. Gary mentioned that I'm on the board of the Frank Church Institute. I want to tell you here, for people that don't know my past, that I started in politics by being a volunteer for Senator Frank Church in 1974 in his campaign. I was lucky enough to be on his staff for 6 years, from 1975 to 1981, and Frank Church was my mentor, and he was my entry into politics, and then it led to my election in 1990 as a member of the United States House of Representatives and from the 1st District of Idaho. There have only been 11,000 members of Congress from the United States, so it's a small alumni association. I'm very proud to have served you in the Congress of the United States. I was lucky enough to serve with Martin Frost. He was in Congress at the same time. He's one of our guests today. And I didn't serve with Tom Davis, who's here, but I followed his career very closely and always admired his ability to reach across the aisle and speak soundly on issues and that were before the Congress. They've written a book, The Partisan Divide, as Gary mentioned. They're going to talk about that and what's brought us to this point. We've had an excellent introduction of the situation in American politics from a historical perspective, but our two guests today have been deeply in the trenches in Congress. Congressman Frost served for 26 years in the House of Representatives. Congressman Davis served for 14, so a total of 40 years of experience that we have with us today. They were both chairman of their respective parties' congressional campaign committees. Martin Frost served as chairman of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, and Tom Davis served as chairman of the Republican Congressional Campaign Committee. So their job was to elect Democrats in Martin's case and Republicans in Tom's case to the Congress of the United States. They've been deeply involved in public service. It's part of their DNA, and it's continued until this day. And I called Martin Frost after they had written their book and knew of the subject of our conference here today and asked him if he would come to Boise, Idaho with Tom and present the facts of their book and discuss this issue with you. And here they are today. So I think my job as moderator is going to be relatively easy because they'll work as a team. I think they'll both speak for about 10 minutes. They have a PowerPoint. And so let's welcome our two guests from Washington, D.C., Congressman Martin Frost and Congressman Tom Davis.
Thank you, Larry. Larry, thank you. So I'm Tom Davis. I'm the Republican. And Martin and I wrote this book together. We got thrown together on some talk shows as a Republican and Democrat. We started comparing notes afterwards. And we thought we'd write a book about the causes of polarization. And let me just say to Dr. Cornell Clay does an excellent presentation. We make some of the same points, so we'll just be reiterative of some of the things you said, and I think also have some different observations as well. Let me just start by saying I only served 7 terms in the House, because in the House, after 3 terms as a committee chairman, you get termed out and you have to rotate, and I just felt it was time to leave. But I did leave Congress undefeated and unindicted, and I'm just very proud of that. You know, how bad is Washington today? My congressional district was a suburban district outside of Washington, D.C., and our football team in Washington is not like Boise State. It's not undefeated, but it's got a controversial name, the Washington Redskins. And Dan Snyder, the owner of the Redskins, was asked at a press conference just a couple months ago, wasn't the term Washington Redskins offensive to some people? Was he thinking of changing the name? And he admitted the term Washington Redskins was indeed a polarizing and divisive name. and he said he was thinking of changing the name from the Washington Redskins to just the Redskins. So I think it kind of sums up the opinion of Washington as you get out into the hinterlands. So what Dr. Clayton talked about in terms of the causes there, globalization, immigration, wealth disparity, these debates aren't going on just in the United States. They're going on across the world. What's kind of unique to the United States is what we're seeing in other countries today is we're seeing third and fourth parties springing up and expressing some of the outrage on the right and the left. Third and fourth parties. In America, it's still defined in a two-party framework. And what's happened to this two-party framework, it's moved the parties from basically centering forces, which they've been for the first 200 years. It's moved them out right and left. And we think there are actually some unique factors in the United States that have exacerbated this. Let's start with the advent of single-party districts. In the House of Representatives today, fully 80% of the House districts are safely drawn for one party or the other. The November is nothing more than what we call a constitutional formality. The real race for these members is their primary election. That's the one that counts. And so members cater their time, their attention, and their voting records. They hew it to their primary voters. And folks, primary voters are a pretty thin ideological slice of the electoral pie. These are the people who follow it and are most eager. We say on the Republican side they're more conservative, on the Democratic side more liberal. We have a saying that liberals and conservatives have passion, moderates have lives. And so the end result is that the passionate end up dominating these areas. These are folks who think they're right and the other side is wrong. They don't reward compromise, they punish compromise. So members get afraid sometimes of crossing and getting out of that party box because they're looking over their right or left shoulders at a primary election. And although most members don't lose their primaries, that's because they hew their votes and their attitudes toward their primary voters. But the defeat of one Eric Cantor just sends shockwaves through the Republican conference, and members act and react accordingly. This advent of single-party districts is the result of what we call residential sorting patterns, the fact that people who live alike live in like-minded enclaves. American cities dominated by Democrats. Most of rural America is pretty Republican. The major exceptions to that are college towns, majority-minority counties, black, Indian, Hispanic, majority rural counties, and then areas like I call like the granola belt, Aspen, Vale, Sun Valley, places like that, very blue hotbeds in the middle. But for the most part, rural Americans and their worldviews tend to line up with the Republican Party. Then you also have the Voting Rights Act. And what we found is when you pack minority voters into districts, you bleach the districts around it, and the end result is a polarizing effect. In the Deep South today, in the House of Representatives, all you have are black Democrats and white Republicans. And no need to talk to the other side because they play no role in the nomination process. And I'll leave it to you if that's a good policy outcome over the long term or not, but it's the reality of American politics today. Well, if this were the only problem, it might be resolvable, but there are two other things that have occurred through time. One are, as you look at this, the money in politics. The money in politics has moved from the parties, which have been a centering force, as I said, out to the wings, and that's the result of campaign finance reform, McCain-Feingold, which basically said the parties and candidates can't take this evil soft money, but anybody else can. And Martin and I both opposed the legislation at the time, and our question was, well, this is a noble cause, but where do you think this money's going to go? Right now it's regulated, it goes to the parties, they tend to be centering forces. This money doesn't just disappear. And in point of fact, it hasn't, aided by a couple court cases, the Citizens United case out of the Supreme Court and the Speech Now case, a D.C. Circuit Court case on a federal election appeal that created super PACs. So the money has now moved from the centering forces, which are candidates and parties, out to the wings, and it tends to be largely ideological money, or at least that's the way it has been channeled. And then finally, of course, and probably most profound, we saw those great ads you had on John Adams and Thomas Jefferson and the attack ads. The one difference is you didn't have this in those days. And look, when the Federal Communications Commission got rid of the equal time doctrine or the fairness doctrine, some radio stations said, well, why do we have to show both sides? And so talk radio was born, and these stations would start getting up a cadre of loyal listenerships. They were great business models. They sold a lot of ads. They had a dedicated group of people that would tune in each day. Cable news picked that up first with Fox News and then MSNBC, and if you've ever watched them both on the same night, you know what I'm talking about. But finally now, most people get their news off the internet. And Franks, the internet has no filters, as you know. What we call the crap to content ratio coming over the internet is just exceptionally high. It came to me when somebody sent me Barack Obama's birth certificate from Kenya over the internet. It had his baby footprint on there, all the certifications. It looked really real. You started to believe it until somebody else sent me his birth certificate from Indonesia. And at that point, you start saying, what is this stuff? But the stuff that people are getting that gets forwarded in the social media is, most of this stuff is what we call crapola. It's outside of the bounds of rational discussion. But people believe this stuff. They live on this stuff. And the body politic and the politicians have to react to that. The combination of this, think of it this way. If the districts have moved from centered competitive districts out here, if the money has moved from the parties in the center out here to the wings, and if the media models and the way people get their news has moved from vetted, factual news out here because of successful business models, what do you expect? And the end result is the polarized politics you talked about. Just Clayton showed this one way. We're going to show it another. A national journal talks each year, rates every member of Congress, who's the most liberal, who's the most conservative, based on about 100 votes. So we took the most liberal Republican and the most conservative Democrat, and we said, how many of them are there between the most liberal Republican and most conservative Democrat? So in 1982, the most liberal Republican was Bill Green. He was a pro-gay Republican in 1982 out of Manhattan. So you know he had to be liberal just to get elected there. Most conservative Democrat was Larry McDonald. He was a John Birch Society member from Georgia, pretty conservative. So we said, how many voters have a median between these two? And it was 344 members back in 1982. Well, by 1994, that had dropped to 252. By 2002, that had dropped to 137. And then after the last Congress, it's gone down to 3. It is the complete ideological sorting of the parties. It's almost parliamentary behavior on the part of members of Congress today. And the voters are behaving that way. They're voting more the party than the person. And as they behave in a parliamentary manner, members come to Congress, and instead of thinking themselves as minority members, they're now opposition members. And it's just changed the whole way Congress operates. Senate had the same thing. You had 58 senators of the 100 between the liberal and conservative in 1982. By 1994, it had dropped to 34. By 2002, it had dropped to 7. And in the last 3 Congresses, as you can see, it's down to 0. As you see, and Clayton made Dr. Clayton made the same points. The party bases have moved along with this on just basic question. Stricter environmental laws. They used to be pretty close between the parties. They have moved apart. This is a congressional district, by the way, just to show you what they look like outside of Idaho, where you have a commission drawing it. This is a Democratic gerrymander in Maryland. It kind of looks like a mosquito. I always said if Picasso were alive today, he could make a good living drawing congressional district, get the same level of artistic fulfillment he got as an artist. He wouldn't have had to go through his blue period. This is another Maryland gerrymander. This is a Republican gerrymander in Pennsylvania. It looks like one dog kicking another dog. The only thing it has in common, it's going to yield a Republican outcome in November. I think this is telling in terms of how the House votes are maldistributed. It shows that in 2002, Democrats got more votes for the House of Representatives than Republicans on a national basis, but Republicans still had a 33-seat margin. In 3 states where the Republicans took control in the 2010 midterms, when it came time to drawing the districts on the new census in 2011, Republicans gerrymandered the districts. And as you can see, in Pennsylvania, Democrats got more votes for the House in the ensuing election than Republicans, but the congressional delegation was 13 Republicans and 5 Democrats. I don't even know if Picasso could have done that. But with the data analytics you have today and the partisan push, they were successful in doing that. The same goes to Michigan, Ohio. By the way, the Democrats did the same thing where they controlled Illinois and Maryland, but they just didn't have a very good midterm in 2010, so they ended up paying a price. Voting rights, as you can see, the voting rights rules are changing as the courts look at what number you need to pack minorities in districts, and I'll let Martin talk a little bit about that when we get to it. think I'm going to turn it over to Martin at this point to talk a little more about it. Let me just say one thing. Divided government is indeed the norm at this point. If you go back to 1980, almost 80% of the time. The House of Representatives is, for this decade, so stacked in favor of the Republicans, it would take a tremendous wave for the Democrats to pick it up. But on the other hand, the Electoral College, the way it is construed today, is really the Democrats' advantage. Republicans, to win it, have to basically run the table on undecided states. So you're going to continue to get this balance. Independents are the largest growing group in the American electorate. Okay, but they generally don't participate in primaries. In some states, they're not allowed to. So they only get the choices that the parties give them. And parties tend to overread their mandates and go too far left or too far right. In the last 3 elections where you've had one party in midterms, where one party has controlled the House, the Senate, and the presidency, the voters have voted them out the next midterm with a vengeance, because independents come out then and they want to make the correction. They may not like their choices, but they make the correction. I always use the analogy that my voters out in Fairfax County, Virginia, elected me to Congress in 1994 to protect them from Bill Clinton, and 2 years later they re-elected Clinton to protect him from me. Then in point of fact, there are a group of people that just they get the choices parties give them. I want to encourage everybody to start voting in primaries because that's where the action is. But let me turn it over to my friend Martin Frost.
I'm really not going to go through too many more slides, but first of all, I want to make it clear I'm Tom Davis's straight man. But I do have 1 or 2 stories for you. And I mentioned, we spoke to a group last night, and I mentioned that I really wanted to come out here to Boise State for a couple of reasons. One was that I had been to 48 states, but I had never been to Idaho. So I can now check another one off my list. The only state I haven't been to is Oregon. I understand it's close by, but I won't make it this trip. Secondly, my hometown, where I grew up, is Fort Worth, Texas. We made a major contribution to the success of the Boise State football team. Let me tell you how we did that. Our team, our hometown team, TCU, used to be in the same conference with Boise State. And when TCU left to go join the Big 12, it took a very tough game off Boise State's calendar. So I wish you well. I think you have a good chance of being undefeated this year, and good luck. Maybe you'll make it to the Cotton Bowl. Maybe you'll get to play Oklahoma again. That would be fun. It was a good result for y'all last time. Now, let me give you a little background, and Tom didn't spend much time on his own personal background, how I got involved in politics. When I was in junior high and high school, a little younger than you are now, I figured out that I could write. And I thought, well, that would be kind of interesting. And I also had politics in the blood. Like a lot of people elected to office, I had some family members who were in politics at one point. My grandfather was mayor of a small town out in East Texas. My great uncle was a member of the Texas state legislature 100 years ago. He was a state senator. So I had politics in the blood. I figured out I could write. And so I decided I would combine the two. And I said, I'll go to Washington and be a political reporter, and I'll be a writer who covers politics. And so I did. I got a job with a magazine, Congressional Quarterly, that covers Congress, Congressional Quarterly Weekly Report. And like most reporters, I met a bunch of congressmen. And like most reporters, they all think this, I decided, these guys are not so special. I could do that job. Most reporters think it, but very few act on that. But I decided, well, I think I'll go to law school, which I did. I went to Georgetown Law School, and then I went back to Texas where I had grown up, and 8 years later, I got elected to Congress. And for those of you, are any of you thinking about running for office someday on some level? Will you hold up your hands? I'm sad that there aren't more of you. We need more young people to run for office. But for those of you who are thinking about running, my advice to you is do what I did a number of years ago. But go back and volunteer in the campaigns of candidates. I volunteered for people running for the state legislature and the school board and the city council, and I did that for two reasons. One, I wanted to learn about grassroots politics, how it operated, and two, I wanted the political people to know who I was, so that when I ran someday, they would say, well, this isn't some guy just in off the street, this guy has actually paid his dues. So that proved to be successful for me, and I was fortunate to serve 13 terms, 26 years. Now, let me comment about some of the proposals in our book and some of the things that Tom has alluded to. We've made some specific suggestions about how you improve our political system, how you can perhaps curb the partisanship that you have in Congress. You can't get rid of all of it, we know that. But here are some of the things we have suggested. One is that states, as you have in Idaho, adopt a commission approach to drawing congressional districts. And it can be done on a bipartisan basis, it can be nonpartisan, but you take it out of the hands of the legislature. And you'll wind up with districts that don't look as crazy as those districts that Tom showed you on the screen, and also that in many cases will be more competitive, so that people running for office will have to speak to people on the other side of the aisle. They'll have to speak to voters on the other side of the aisle. And we've suggested that Congress could pass a statute requiring state legislatures to use nonpartisan, bipartisan commissions. Very few states have that today. California does, Arizona does, state of Washington, Iowa, and also New Jersey. And in 4 of those 5 states, in addition to what you have here, in 4 of those 5 states, that was actually done through the referendum and initiative process, where voters put something on the ballot and forced the legislature to actually do that. The legislatures kind of like the system the way it is. Members of the legislature, they got elected under the system. They know it. Members of their own party got elected under the system. So very few legislatures are going to take it upon themselves to switch to a more competitive situation. But we're hopeful that that could occur in the future. Secondly, and this, we had a number of slides on the role of money, but I want to summarize this very briefly, and Tom did a pretty good job. What's happened now is that in a congressional race, and this is true somewhat in the presidential race, but not entirely, in a congressional race, only about 1/3 of the money that is spent is actually raised by the candidate and spent putting out his or her own message. 2/3 of the money comes from outside groups, either what are called candidate-specific super PACs. That money does have to be reported, but you can give people can give unlimited amounts of money to these super PACs, whereas a person can only give a relatively small amount. $2,700 is the most an individual can write directly to a candidate running in a primary or in a general election. So you have these super PACs that can take unlimited corporate contributions, unlimited labor contributions, large contributions from wealthy individuals. They have to report that. Then you have what are called C4s, which are social welfare organizations. I was watching TV here. When I got here yesterday and this morning, I saw one of those ads from a C4 organization. It happened to be an ad attacking Clinton. It could have been an ad attacking Trump. These C4s aren't required to disclose their contributors. You don't know who's putting up this money. And so this is the dark money you hear about in politics. And Tom and I, when McCain-Feingold was being considered, told the sponsors of that legislation, you don't quite understand what's going to happen. You're taking money away from political parties and you're forcing it out to the wings. None of us understood that this would be on steroids. How much money would be spent by the wings in politics, some of it in undisclosed ways. And so the campaigns in some cases have been taken away from the candidates themselves. Sometimes these groups come in and take ads that the candidate wouldn't necessarily choose to have as their first choice. In other cases, there is coordination between the candidates. There's not supposed to. Under the law, candidate can't talk to one of these outside groups, but it happens all the time. And I'm going to take just a minute, because it's fun. We have a brief section in our book on the subject of coordination by these outside groups. And it happened to be a column written by a nationally known humorist. His name is Calvin Trillin. Now, I don't know if any of you all have ever heard of him. Some of the older people in the room would have heard of him. He writes for the New Yorker and for the New York Times. He also happens to be my wife's cousin. So he wrote a wonderful column about this subject right after these groups started proliferating, particularly the super PACs. And I'm just going to read you. It's very brief. I'm going to read you an excerpt from it. And this is on the issue of coordination, of whether these outside groups can talk to the candidates and actually have a common strategy. When super PACs were just getting started in 2012, nationally known humorist Calvin Trillin wrote a satirical piece for the New York Times on the requirement that there be no coordination between a candidate and a super PAC supporting the candidacy. In the piece, Trillin discussed a mythical super PAC, America the Super, set up by the mother of mythical candidate Jeff Gold, who was running for the Senate. Trillin interviewed the super PAC's chief executive on the question of coordination. Trillin, well, you do understand the assumption, some have, that there might be more contact than the spirit of the law intends there to be, given your closeness with Mr. Gold. Super PAC CEO, my closeness? What do you mean by my closeness? Because, well, you're his CEO. Because I'm his mother? Well, yes, because you're his mother. It's natural for people to assume that the two of you often talk. CEO, he never calls, he never writes. Now, you think this is funny. It actually happened in the 2014 elections. You had super PACs set up, and we detail this in the book, by close relatives of candidates. And there's a wonderful, we detailed 4 of these, 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans, and I'm just going to read you the description of one of the cases where it happened. The Boston Herald reported on August 6, 2014, that Shirley Grossman, the mother of Massachusetts Democratic candidate for governor Steve Grossman, gave $100,000 to a super PAC supporting her son's candidacy, Mass Forward PAC. Mrs. Grossman, 92, told the Herald, I believe in Steve. He's well-educated, honest, experienced, and all of the ideas he has are great, close quote. Candidate Grossman insisted that he had no prior knowledge of his mother's contribution. Now, so I contacted my wife's cousin. I said, can we quote your column? He said, fine. He said, fine. And he said, you know, Martin, it's hard to make things up in politics anymore because not only did this actually happen, he later wrote another column about the shoe bomber. And he said, you know, the next thing you're going to know, there's going to be an underwear bomber. Well, there was an underwear bomber, so you can't make any of this stuff up anymore. Now, so what do we recommend? We recommend at the very minimum that all organizations that accept money, large contributions, and mention a federal candidate by name have to disclose all their contributors. They have to file a list with the Federal Election Commission. At least there'd be some transparency. We'd know more about what's going on. Tom and I have a couple of other recommendations. One, that all the primaries for Congress and the House, for Congress and the Senate, be on the same day nationwide, not the presidential, but so there'd be a larger turnout. Because the problem you have is primaries are low turnout elections, and only the most extreme people, often the most dedicated people, vote in the primary. So you can have an unrepresentative candidate come out of the primary, but if it's a safe district, that person's going to win the general election, and that person has no incentive to talk to the other side, the party on the other side. If he or she does, then they'll be criticized, and so someone will run against them in the next primary. So let's increase turnout. We have some other recommendations. As I said, we recommend districts done by commissions, change the reporting laws to disclose who these contributors are. We have a terrific country. We have the best political system in the world, but that doesn't mean that it can't be improved. It doesn't mean that we can do some things to try and eliminate the harsh partisanship that exists today, that's existed previously in our country. We don't mean to pretend this has never occurred before, but it's particularly harsh today, and it's particularly tough today because Congress can't get anything done. Congress is deadlocked, and it's not in the interest of our country that we have a Congress that can't function. And that's whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, you hope that Congress can give some results for the country. And I'm going to give one example in the past when Congress actually could go across party lines, and then I'm going to be quiet and let you all ask questions. Some of you may have seen the HBO movie All the Way about the presidency of Lyndon Johnson. When Lyndon Johnson was elected when he became president after the Kennedy assassination in 1964, his first priority was to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Now, there was a problem with that, and he had been Senate Majority Leader, and he understood the problem. There was going to be a filibuster, an anti-civil rights filibuster in the Senate, and at that time it took 67 votes to break a filibuster. Johnson knew that he had to have Republican support. He didn't have 67 votes to break a filibuster. He had to have the support of some Republicans if he were going to ever pass the Civil Rights Bill. And he went to Everett McKinley Dirksen, the Republican leader from Illinois. And this has all been detailed in several books about Johnson. And he said, Ev, you're from the land of Lincoln. You need to be for civil rights. He ultimately convinced Everett McKinley Dirksen to provide the Republican votes to break the filibuster against civil rights. And without that cooperation across party lines, the civil rights bill would never have passed. You have to ask yourself, could that happen today, given the partisan environment we have? And the answer is probably no. Even if Johnson were back today, if he were alive today and at his full strength and president, even someone as savvy and as wily as Lyndon Johnson might not be able to cross the partisan divide and get things done for the country. So we've got to do something to make it possible for members to talk to each other, even if it's just by degrees, so that we can get things done for the good of the country. We want to turn it over to y'all so you can ask some questions. Tom and I both teach government on a part-time basis. It's kind of an avocation. Tom teaches at George Mason, where he is the chairman of the board, George Mason University in Virginia. I teach at the Graduate School of Political Management at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. So we're used to answering questions from students. And I will tell you, some of the questions I get from my students are much tougher than the questions I get from the adults. So please feel free to, there are microphones around, please feel to ask us anything about either the current political situation or the partisan divide that we've discussed. Thank you. Don't be bashful. I'm going to have to stand up because I can't see through the podium. Okay. And,
I wonder if you might elaborate a little bit on Dr. Clayton's first presentation, and insofar as whether you feel incivility and partisanship on the part of the Congress leads public opinion or follows it.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Very good. And Tom actually has written and talked about that quite a bit. Do you want to start, Tom?
Yeah. So, look, let me go on here.
Yeah, go ahead.
The incentives today are to be more outrageous. I always say when Joe Wilson got up and yelled, "You lie," in the State of the Union, what happened to him? He raised $1 million online the next week. He was the darling of talk radio and cable television on the right channels. And in his district, that's really all that made any difference. Alan Grayson did the same thing on the Democratic side. He said Republicans' health care plan is to let seniors die. He became the darling. So we are basically, because of these media models, outrage basically gets rewarded. It doesn't punished, given the fact that they're going back to these same districts. And that's a bad group of incentives. And there aren't any rules anymore. We keep spiraling toward the bottom. Just when you think you've hit the bottom, it tends to get worse, unfortunately.
And I mentioned at the beginning that I started my professional life as a journalist. I am not for censorship. I am not for prior restraint. We have to learn to live with the system we have. We have to learn to live with the fact that there's so much information out there on a partisan basis, and it's available, and a lot of it's not factually checked, but that's the system we have. That's not something we can legislate away.
Yeah, and voters seem to reward it as well. I mean, again, because in these single-party districts, kind of the more outrageous you get, the more you raise online, and you pick up volunteers. So we've seen this in this presidential campaign. I don't think you've ever had anybody say their opponent ought to be in jail on a national debate before, and it goes back and forth. So if the voters don't seem concerned about it, you're going to continue to get bad behavior.
Okay. We've got another question over here, I think. I'm looking around. Oh, right here. Well, I'm sorry. Yeah, go ahead at this mic, and then we'll go back over here.
Okay, so we're talking about like political polarization. How I think that often we learn like political association through our families and through our schools. How can we educate our youth to not be so polarized and to be able to see both sides?
Well, it's a really interesting question because I will tell you that I find a lot of the students that I teach in college have not really had a strong background in civics and American government. That's really important these days, and some schools do it better than others. I would hope that you attend schools where you have a good program in how our government operates. We get some understanding, but it's not easy, and particularly because young people get so much of their information over the internet. And so we have to really work at that. We have to do that through our schools, and our public officials have to do that. I will tell you that I have children and grandchildren. I communicate with them online, and they react to things that are online. They don't read newspapers anymore. Yeah. Go ahead. Maybe someone over here. We'll go to different sides.
After this election, do you feel that people will want to get back to issues as opposed to personalities, or are this spiral just going to continue?
Tom, you want to try?
Yeah, I think we're going to get back to issues when Congress comes back right away. There's going to be, there will be things introduced and alternatives, and you get into health care and trade, and so I think it gets back into this. I think the Trump connection was really not a issue connection. I think Ted Cruz thought he'd figured it out. This was going to be guns, abortion. We know how to feed these rural voters that have started voting Republicans. I don't know, Martin, if we have a map of how the Republican Party coalition.
It's way far down.
It'd be helpful to find it. Do you have the clicker?
No, I don't have the clicker. Seems to have disappeared.
Okay. I know Congress will discuss issues. I'm concerned about the congressional members and presidential candidates discussing issues, because it doesn't seem that the public. I had a professor at the University of Texas a long time ago who said the downfall of American democracy will be television. And at the time, I thought he was extreme. I have written him lately. He's now in Virginia at the university there, and told him that I think he's absolutely correct, that television and social media make lies as true as truth. And I don't know how we get that genie back in the bottle.
So let me just walk you through what's happened here. I like this map because it shows you the counties that Bill Clinton carried in 1996 that Barack Obama lost in 2012, even though Obama outperformed Clinton. And as you can see, it's a wide swath of rural America, Appalachia. These 72 of the 100 poorest counties in the country voted for Romney. So despite the economic rhetoric that you hear from the parties, these are basically cultural alignments. And so people, and I think Dr. Clayton talked about this very well, these culture and worldviews are shaping people's political opinions more than economics. I came into politics as an economic conservative. That's why I'm a Republican. Those are the issues that moved me, and what I saw over time. What happened to me, Mark?
There's one other I want to put.
Well, let me keep that one up for a second. He who controls the clicker controls the dialogue. Okay. In my county, Fairfax, it's a yellow county. The yellow counties are counties that Bob Dole carried in 96, that Obama carried in 2012. And we have just seen a change in the Republican Party from more an upscale country club type of party toward a blue-collar base. And what Donald Trump did is he recognized this really wasn't about issues. It wasn't about guns. It wasn't about abortion. It wasn't about the EPA as much as it was about the emotional worldview connections, anti-establishment view, and he was able to trump, I think, a lot of other people, 16 other candidates who thought they had the secret sauce. But I think we get back to issues pretty quickly because issues ultimately make a difference. Public policy makes a huge difference, and I think Congress is less about personalities than it is about issues. So we'll get back to that. This is the current map of the 2012 election. That blue dot in Idaho up there is Blaine County. I think Moscow, that area also went. But by and large, as you look at this, you can see that rural America tends to be very conservative and more Republican in its outlook. Urban America, the swath of blue counties through the South are African American majority counties or cities for the most part. We're a very divided country as you look at that along cultural lines. Here's the problem for Republicans. Martin can talk about this. Is the country's getting less white. The percent of the white vote has gone from 88% to 72%. It may go lower this time. And if Republicans can't find a way to communicate with non-whites, they're destined. It's a downward spiral. So I think this dialogue changes pretty quickly because parties traditionally resort themselves to be competitive. It's not going to happen this time.
This is one that is really important. The electorate has changed, and the Republican Party has had a difficult time adjusting to the changing electorate. And you will see that in the year 1992, 87% of the votes cast were cast by white voters. If you go down to 2012, only 72% of the votes were cast by white voters. So what that means that in 1992, only 13% of the electorate was minority. Now that electorate is 28% minority. So that, and the minority voters have sided primarily with the Democrats. The Republicans have to figure this out because they are on the losing side of how the electorate is changing. There is hope for the Republican Party. I'm a Democrat. I'm not, trying to help them, but everybody recognizes there is hope for them even with the changing electorate, and that's the Hispanic community. I represented a large number of Hispanics in my district in Texas. Hispanics are culturally conservative. They are patriotic, they are pro-family, they are entrepreneurial, they are people who should be natural allies for the Republican Party. But the Republican Party, because of its anti-immigration rhetoric, has driven Hispanics to the Democratic Party. I don't know if this chart shows it, I don't believe it does, we had another one that in 2004, George W. Bush won 44% of Hispanic voters. Romney only won 27% of Hispanic voters in 2012, and it's likely that Trump will win less than 20% of Hispanic voters in this election. If the Republican Party could ever figure out how to get off of its extreme anti-immigrant rhetoric, it has a chance of bringing Hispanics back into their fold, and that would help them even with the demographic change going on in the country. But they haven't been able to figure that out so far. Yes, ma'am.
Yes. I was active in Idaho and congressional politics during my career. I've just retired. And so I was in the Idaho legislature when they passed the closed primary bill. And personally, I was quite concerned about that because in a closed primary, obviously, you get a ballot where unless you have declared whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, you do not get the full ballot. So I have 3 questions. How many states have closed primaries? 2, is there an increase in that number? What's the trend? And finally, I'll be real interested in your impression on the impact of closed primaries.
It's a very interesting question.
On elections.
Very interesting question. A closed primary means that you have to have registered in your state as a member of the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. I don't know the exact numbers, but a very significant number of states do not have closed primaries. My home state of Texas, Tom's state of Virginia, permits you to register to vote, and you don't have to specify a party when you register. So you can show up on election day and vote in either party's primary. Or if you're an independent, you can vote in either party's primaries. Some states, when they've enacted a closed primary, prohibit people who are registered as independents from voting in either party's primary. And what Tom talked about was that the fact that in a closed primary situation, only the true believers tend to vote in party primaries, and the largest number of people in the country self-identify as independents, not as Democrats or Republicans, and yet those independents are screened out in many states with closed primaries from taking part in the nominating process, which ultimately is the single most important thing, because whoever wins the primary in many of these districts is going to get to be the ultimate office holder. I don't know the exact number. Southern states traditionally have open primaries. You don't have to register by party. Some northern states require party registration, and it's more mixed in the Midwest. But
it's mixed overall. Massachusetts, 52% of registered voters are independents, but you can vote in primaries. My state of Virginia, until this next election, it's been a convention state. And if you think primaries are conservative or liberal, you ought to go to these conventions. Who in their right mind takes 2 days out of their lives to go to Richmond and sit down through 6 ballots as you go through a nomination process? Only the true believers. So the idea of a closed primary is it makes each party a little more ideological, and so that has been a trend. I'd say about 20 states have the closed primary.
And the problem is when you add all this outside money on top of a closed primary, it means a relatively small group of people, and primary turnouts are maybe 10 or 5% of electorates in some states. It means that a lot of outside money can come in. You have a very extreme group of people who vote in the primary, and independents have no role at all. And then they get to the general election, they say, how did these two candidates get to be nominated? Well, either they didn't vote, voluntarily didn't vote in a primary, or they were actually screened out from voting in primaries. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi. That's loud.
Hi.
So, I just had a quick question about, like, your thoughts on voter turnout and how it's declining, especially amongst young people.
I'm sorry, could you say that again?
The question's on voter turnout and voting turnouts among young people.
And how it's declining.
Yeah. You want to start, Tom?
Well, yeah, I mean, look, whoever shows up, it dominates, and we have, about 40% of eligible voters don't either register or don't bother to show up on election day. It's really pretty low turnouts and so on. On the other hand, I think, as our previous speaker noted, a lot of the voting today is just tribal voting. It's not issue oriented. You're with your party, right or wrong. You change your views, and people have to make up their minds. Not voting is a way of protest. It's a way of, we say, voting with your feet of candidates if you don't provide appropriate. Martin and the Democrats seem to believe that the larger turnouts are necessarily good for democracy. I'm not sure that that's necessarily true. I'd like to have informed voters. And I think you've got a lot of voters out there right now that are voting with their gut, that are voting in a tribal fashion, both right and left. So we disagree on disagree on those.
The problem is that young voters have historically had a lower participation rate than older voters. But in the last two elections, Obama was able to mobilize and inspire a number of young voters who did take part, and we don't know whether that's going to continue in this election. I have one other footnote to this. Some states, including my state of Texas, have adopted very strict voter ID laws in trying to, they say, to prevent voter fraud, but they've had the effect in some states of making it difficult for young people to vote. In my state of Texas, we have a requirement of a photo ID to be able to vote. Now, if you're a college student, state of Texas does not accept your college ID, even if it has your picture on it. They do accept a right to carry a concealed firearm as an adequate ID. So I would hope that we would move away. We would make it easier for college students to vote, not harder for college students to vote. Yes.
All right. Oh, there we go. So every time when I see an election, I notice that the candidate almost mirrors the voters that they're looking for. Like a Republican, he's pro-gun, pro-life and all that, and the voters exactly mirror that. Same for Democrats, like anti-gun, pro-choice and all that. So my question is, are the voters a factor in why there's political polarization? Because these guys, they always seem to want to appease to this type of voter. Is that also a reason why we don't see any, people conservatives that have a little liberal ideas, or Democrats that have conservative ideas? Is that why we're forced to go with like the hardline Dems?
Well, let me start with that. Yeah, so you go back to that previous map and you see what's happened. The Republicans have kind of devolved into a more rural party. So you used to have a lot of pro-gun Democrats. I voted for the assault weapons ban when I was in Congress. I voted for background checks. My social policies were probably more liberal than the average Republican, my immigration views, but my economic views were very conservative. And so it fit my district, which was an upscale suburban district, the wealthiest district in the country outside of Washington, D.C., and I got along just fine. But I saw as the National Party started to move south and into rural areas, the national brand and the candidates that we were nominating nationally reflected kind of a different viewpoint than a lot of my constituents had. And over time, that changed the brand of the party. Now, I was still able to overcome that. I never had a really close re-election race, but I was the only Republican that was winning races and stuff because I was lucky enough, with the help of earmarks, to carry my own brand in my Northern Virginia district. Starting out today, it's very difficult for someone to come in and win a primary if you're alienating key constituencies in that party. And I think that's the problem that you're seeing. There are still a lot of Republicans who believe in gun restrictions, a lot of Democrats who don't believe in them. But through the nomination process and the way these districts are drawn, it kind of drives the process where those people don't find themselves nominated very often.
When I was chair of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, it was in 1996 and 1998, it was a long time ago, I made a point of recruiting Democratic candidates in the South and in border states who were pro-gun. And I got criticized by some of my colleagues. You know, well, we don't agree with that. Why are you going out and recruiting people who are anti-gun control? And I said the magic number is 218. We want to have a majority in the House. If you're in the majority party, you get the Speaker, and the Speaker controls everything. The Senate is a much more loosely organized body, but the Speaker determines what legislation goes to the floor. The Speaker has great control over the way the House operates. So our objective was to get to 218, and to get to 218, my view was that we needed to have some diversity in the party. Unfortunately, we don't have very many conservative Democrats anymore, and it's harder for us to get to 218, plus the way the districts are drawn. Other questions? Yeah. About which side do we go to?
Go ahead, right to right.
Okay, go ahead.
Hello. So we've talked a lot about voter turnout so far today, and I was wondering what your thoughts are on the people who are, I guess, dissatisfied with the choices they have this election, and their argument is that they're not going to vote as a protest. And perhaps what do you think about countries where voting is compulsory among citizens?
I don't believe you should fine citizens if they don't vote, if that's what you're asking. Some countries do that. You know, I speak to a lot of groups of foreign journalists from time to time, and I know Tom does some of this too, and I spoke to a group of Japanese journalists recently, and they said, how in the world did you nominate the two most unpopular people who've ever run for president in this election? And I said, well, it was kind of a perfect storm. Trump figured out how you could get all this free media, and he managed to just sail along, and the other people in his own party couldn't compete with him. And Hillary's only opponent was someone, Bernie Sanders, who'd been a socialist all of his life and didn't become a Democrat until the day he filed for office. And so a lot of traditional Democrats said, no, he may have some good ideas, but we'd like to nominate somebody who actually has been a Democrat their entire career. Now, as it turned out, Clinton has incorporated a lot of Bernie's ideas in her platform now, but it was a perfect storm that produced Clinton and Trump. I'm not sure that will happen next time. I think maybe you will have candidates who will be more popular next time, I hope.
Yeah, well, come on, let me just answer that for a second. I think you have every right not to vote, and sometimes you just don't get the choices you want and you vote with your feet, and I think that punishes politicians. They feel, well, gee, you're out there, we need to appeal to you. Part of the narrative on the Republican primary was that Romney really didn't identify with a lot of rural voters the last time, and we needed somebody who could appeal to that. And that was both the Cruz appeal and the Trump appeal to some extent. We'll find out if those missing voters, if they make it up, or if the trade-off in what they lose in suburban voters works or not. But not voting is a perfect right that you have. I'd also add, Martin thinks that there are all these obstacles to voting. If you want to register today, you can go right outside. I think they got you have a bus out there, a mobile plane, show your ID, and you can register. We make it almost too easy. I think these rules on absentee voting are so easy and so lax right now, you get a lot of people that play the rules. It's not that difficult for somebody who's really interested in it. What really happens is in my district is they walk through these apartment developments, which are all immigrants, register people, talk to them 8 times, get them to fill out an absentee. You talk to these people later, they don't know what they did. But somebody came to their door and gave them the pitch and everything else. I'm not sure that's particularly healthy for democracy. You'd like to have more informed voters.
We have a fundamental disagreement on that.
Yes, we do.
We won't elaborate. Anyway, go ahead.
As the last question stated, a lot of people are pretty dissatisfied with this year's candidates, to say the least. Many are staying out of the election, but a lot more are voting for a third party quite enthusiastically, whether they agree more with their policies or they're just voting with their conscience. And it makes me wonder, what barriers would a particular third party face in order to establish itself among the Democratic Party and the Republican Party?
It's a very good question. On the presidential level, our system is stacked against third party candidates. Under our system, and I think you all know this, but it doesn't hurt to repeat it, whoever gets the most votes in a state gets all that state's electoral votes. You can get a plurality. You don't have to get a majority. There are 3 candidates. You get less than 50%, but you get more than anybody else. You get all the electoral votes of that state. There are only 2 states that divide their electoral votes, Nebraska and Maine, and they do them by congressional districts. The problem with the third-party candidate is that you can get a big vote, but it can be spread out evenly across the country, and you wind up with 0 electoral votes. That's what happened to Ross Perot in 1992. He got almost 20% of the popular vote, but he didn't carry a single state, so he got no electoral votes. So our system with the Electoral College is stacked against a third-party candidate.
Well, even more than that, if nobody gets a majority of the Electoral College, it goes to the House of Representatives. And under the Constitution, only the top 3 people who get electoral votes can be considered then. Each state gets 1 vote in that. And the Congress is still a 2-party system. So on the third-party system, you may have a third-party candidate that gets a plurality of the voters, could even get a plurality of the Electoral College. But if they don't get a majority, it goes to Congress, and the Congress is still pretty 2-party at this point.
But it's damn hard to carry states for a third-party candidate. It's very hard.
Well, the last time that happened was 1968.
But it's only a few states.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, go ahead. Other questions, which go over here.
Whatever.
I just want to ask you guys a question about how you see females making a larger, just like a bigger part in politics and the rhetoric used against them. Many insults are directed towards men, and now with the increasing volume of women in politics, how do you see the rhetoric changing to address the women, and do you see more women coming into politics and being for certain things and against others?
So
fascinating.
I'm
going to start on this one, Tom, because it's
start on every other one too.
It's a fascinating question, and we see what's happened in this election. What you have in 5 of this is a statistic that's rarely reported. In 5 of the last 6 presidential elections, the Democratic candidate has carried the vote of white females. Let me say that again.
The Republican has.
The Republican candidate has carried the vote of white female voters. That's counterintuitive because you always hear about a gender gap, but it's a reason because minority women vote so heavily Democratic that in toto, the Democratic candidates carry the female vote, but the Republican candidate in 5 of the last 6 elections has carried the vote of white women. What's happened this time is that the Trump candidacy has stood that on its head. And now white women, particularly college-educated white women, are no longer voting Republican. They're voting for Hillary. Some future Republican candidate is going to have to not do that. To have a chance.
Do you see more women wanting to become like a politician and going into politics because of this election?
Yeah, let me. So my wife was in the state legislature. She was 3 terms in the state house, was majority whip in the state house in Virginia, then went to the state senate. Here's my experience: is that women make better candidates than men. The threshold that they have is sometimes men are assumed to know more and have some experience, but when women cross that threshold and show they're informed, people don't think women are as likely to be corrupt, and they end up making better candidates. So I went out of my way as campaign chairman to look for women candidates. Shelley Moore Capito's a senator now, and for Republicans especially, because there's a gender gap that traditionally has given Democrats a slightly larger margin among women than Republicans. If you're a woman and you want to go into politics, I can't think of a better time than going into it after this election at this point. If you're a Republican in particular, they're going to be looking around because they're going to suffer, I think, a larger gender gap in this campaign than they have before. But there is plenty of room for informed women. We're seeing a greater number of women now in the Senate and in House races than at any time in history. So yeah, go at it. I think the public's ripe for it.
Yeah, and it's very interesting that if you look at countries around the world, many industrial democracies have elected women to be either prime minister or president, whatever the top position is. We are one of the last to have, if Hillary is successful in this election, to have elected a woman president. India, Great Britain, Germany, Israel, a number of countries, Scandinavian countries, have already had women rise to the top position in their country. It's going to happen in this country. I happen to think it will happen this election, but if it doesn't happen this election, it will happen in the not too distant.
I think we have time for just one more question, and I feel bad that there are others lined up here, but
let's try to move through quickly.
You can buy the book or get it at the library, or so one more question here.
When our government was first established, we followed the words of Aristotle that we should have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and those became our natural rights. How do you think those will be affected after this election?
Tom, you want to try?
No, I think they still arrive. Look, I think the difference is we talk about the pursuit of happiness. Government can't guarantee happiness. And I think sometimes we get politicians who think they can guarantee it and give people things that we can't afford. And I think that continues to be a huge issue. But I think we're going to survive this election just fine. The rhetoric has been a little bit harsher on both sides. Well, the one thing about this election is you've never had candidates with such high unfavorabilities. And what worries me are two things. One is I think there is a huge distrust of basic institutions that we need in a democracy just to survive and to flourish. And that distrust is going down among both the right and the left as you look at it. And secondly, like you say, the rhetoric has just gotten way out of hand, really on both sides, because it's a spiral down. You kind of match what's going on. I think we're going to be fine after this. We'll kind of all take a shower after this election and try to start again. And I think there will be a much lower turnout here than you had 4 years ago. Whatever you think, Hillary Clinton is not Barack Obama in terms of her appeal to certain groups. And she's got high negatives. She's been in the public eye a long time. She's been subject to a lot of examination through time that has not always stood up that well. Donald Trump's also been in the public eye a long time in a different way. In reality TV and those kind of issues has come up. And I think this race has kind of dumbed the whole thing down, but I think we're going to be just fine, whatever happens after this election. We'll go on, the losers will lick their wounds, go on and try to see what do we need to do to reconstitute our coalition so we can win the next time.
Yeah, I agree with Tom. That we're a great country, and we always have been. We will be in the future, no matter what happens after this election.
Before we thank our speakers, I just want to recognize that former Congressman Thomas Railsback has joined us today. He's in the front row.
He was one of the really good ones.
He served for 8 terms in the House of Representatives. He served for 8 terms in the U.S. House of Representatives from Illinois, and now I think he spends most of his time in McCall, which is really a good decision on his part, Tom. Thank you for being here. Let's give our speakers a great BSU and Idaho expression of thanks. Marty, Tom, thank you very much. Thank you for your questions. It's been a great panel.
Hello. Is this on? Oh, sorry.
If you'll let the congressman leave, they have to catch a flight, please. Wherever you want to be. All right, we're going to assemble our next panel. If you take your seats, please.
So we have to like look up to you? Okay. That's a good point.
Just seem it would work better, I think, and you can interact better with the moderators over either on this side or speaking.
I didn't.
Please take your seats and allow the congressman to leave because they have a flight to catch.
Over, and I'm like, that's great. I meant to spend a little more time thinking about him, but we'll just go with the flow here. I think we'll be okay.
I mean, I wrote the questions just sort of stream of consciousness. So
yeah. Well, a lot of these guys, they were lined up with questions, so I'm sure we can get some questions from the audience before it's over.
All right, as everyone is getting settled again, let me introduce our second panel this morning. Hello?
I know. We got a lot of, we got to be a little more optimistic.
Our second panel this morning is titled The Presidential Election and the Bumpy Road Ahead, and it will be moderated by Dr. Justin Vaughn, an associate professor of political science at Boise State. He's co-director of the Center for Idaho History and Politics and author of Controlling the Message, New Media in American Political Campaigns. Dr. Vaughn.
Thank you very much, Gary. So I'm really pleased to be here with a couple of really extraordinary panelists, and I'm going to do everything I can to stay out of their way and let them have a conversation that I think is going to be as edifying as any that we've been able to participate in over the course of this election cycle. But before I do that, I want to reinforce the fact that I'm a college professor and make a couple of announcements. Number one, as we heard Congressman Frost mention, the film All the Way about LBJ and Martin Luther King and their work together on a major piece of legislation that maybe would not have been possible to do today. We're showing that film actually on campus. The Center for Idaho History and Politics is sponsoring it for free next Wednesday, 6 o'clock in the Special Events Center, which is adjacent to this building. So if you're interested in that, come back next week and check it out. And then also, as Congressman Davison mentioned, as Gary Winsky has mentioned, also, if you feel like voting after all this talk about civic goodness, then you can just go right outside behind the Student Union building, and there's a setup where you can register and vote at least once, whenever you like. So, like I said, we have a couple of really great experts on campaign politics with us today, and not only are they experts on campaign politics, but they both have really rich backgrounds in kind of the entire scope of governance. Right to my left is John Engber, who was kind and generous enough with his time to come join us from Seattle, Washington. John has been involved in on the policy and campaign side of politics for many years. Currently, he's principal at the John Engber and Associates firm, public affairs strategy firm based in Seattle. Prior to that, he was senior vice president with an influential firm, Strategies 360, in Washington. For over a decade before that, John was the state director for Senator Patty Murray, and prior to that had worked in multiple places throughout the United States for a variety of candidates, including members of Congress like Jay Inslee and Brian Baird, organizations typically on the Democratic side of things like the Sierra Club and NARAL pro-choice, and a variety of other candidates for all sorts of different kinds of offices. So John comes to us with a great degree of expertise, not just about Western democratic politics, but national politics as well. To John's left is my friend Todd Craney, who I've been fortunate to learn a lot from over the last year or so. Todd is managing partner at Riverwood Strategies here in the Treasure Valley. Before that, Todd was the National Deputy Political Director for Mitt Romney's presidential campaign in 2012. He also worked for Mitt Romney as a coordinator for Western states in 2008. He's been involved in a lot of other races at all levels of government, from the California legislature to Meg Whitman's campaign in California, to Arnold Schwarzenegger's campaign in California, to the George W. Bush administration's re-election effort. He's also worked on the policy side as well. He was a presidential appointee during the Bush administration in the Department of Agriculture, and worked for Senator Orrin Hatch from Utah as a policy advisor in the United States Senate. And so both these guys have a wealth of knowledge and are still at the moment really tied into what's happening in our region and nationally within their two parties. And what I want to do is kick this conversation off with the question about the fact that as professional political consultants and folks have been active with a variety of different kind of campaigns and in government in a variety of ways, what are you seeing in this election that may be a little bit different than what we hear in the national media narrative, or that, you know, when we have our partisan hats on, we might miss? And so, I'll start with you, John.
Well, welcome everybody. I'm going to start with a confession, which is I found out last night that there were going to be hundreds of high school students here in addition to college students, and so I've spent the last 14 hours thinking about how I can be less negative about this election year and inspire you guys and challenge you guys to fix this system, because it's going to be in your hands as you turn 18 and have that opportunity to have your impact. One other quick thought, in regards to the young woman who asked about women running for office. I mean, I hope that young women and young men, over the next few years, just stream to the opportunities to run for office. I mean, if there's anything this election year should teach all of you, is that anybody can run for office, and I don't mean that to be snarky. I mean that to really say, if Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders can be strong candidates for presidential nominations, and obviously Donald Trump being nominated, everybody in this audience is qualified to run for something, and offices all impact your life. They impact the cost of college tuition. They impact your health care. They impact a lot of things that impact you. So Todd and I are going to, we've heard about incivility and we've heard about dysfunctionality of government, and Todd and I are going to contribute to that dialogue in a few minutes. But I challenge all of you to fix it by getting involved yourselves. So, Todd, I'll let you go.
Yeah, thanks, John. And I think I found out about 5 minutes ago that there was going to be high school students in here, so maybe I'll be a little more negative. No, I'm joking, of course. I would just echo what John is saying, and kind of to Justin's question. You guys all have heard the narrative, and we'll talk more about this, about how negative this campaign has been and how difficult the rhetoric has been in this campaign. But I agree with John 100%. Ultimately, you guys in this room are going to be the solution, because you are the future. And it really is in your hands, whether it is with you going to the ballot box and voting, or whether it is you volunteering on campaigns, or whether it is you running for office. And if I were to say, what is the one thing we need more of, which I agree with John, in politics, we need better people to step up and run for office. You get what you pay for. And ultimately, a lot of life is showing up. And a lot of people are not showing up right now, and I'm afraid that we're reaping kind of the results of that. But I'd also say that you are all pretty smart people in this room, and I would say that history matters. And I think we got to take a step back, even though this is a very negative time in our country's political discourse for many reasons. But we got to take a step back. This country has been through difficult times before. I mean, we've been through world wars, we've been through a civil war, we've been through a lot of challenging times. And at the end of the day, the generation of that time met those challenges and carried it forward and left us a greater country that we all could enjoy. And we have those blessings now, and we've got to do the same. We've got to step up and meet those challenges. And so I would say, to Justin's question and to echoing what John is saying, that's what we need to have right now. Is there needs to be more conversation about the goodness. It's easy to talk about the negative in anything in life, particularly politics, but we all know in our lives and in this country there's a tremendous amount of good and a tremendous amount of positive stuff going on. We've got to turn the tide here and show some leadership. And by the way, your politicians will follow your lead. Ultimately, you vote them in. We always hope that our politicians will always be the leaders, and we remain hopeful that will happen. But at the end of the day, we, the people, are the leaders, and we need to step up and be more positive. And that needs to be more of a conversation and a narrative that I think that needs to happen in this country, and something that can happen. And you guys have it in your hands to do that. So I want to pick up on that last kind of comment that Todd made. We are all concerned. You know, there's national concern about civility. Professor Clayton gave a really great presentation at the beginning of our conference this morning, providing some historical context that maybe we're more concerned than we ought to be, but still, it's a major national kind of conversation that's happening. Do you either of you see this election as a turning point or the beginning of going further off the civility cliff? Do you think things get better without, naturally, or?
I got to take that one, huh?
Start that one off.
Wow. I mean, I wish I had a crystal ball, and I guess the answer to that question is I'm not sure. I'm hopeful that we can, again, looking at history, there's ups and downs, and we can turn the tide here. I think a couple of challenges are going on here that we all need to think about. We have a big shift in demographics going on in this country right now. So we're in the midst of a big shift in demographics. I think some of that's been discussed. We're also in a big shift on technology. And as we all know, technology can be really, really good and great, and it is. And it's powered a lot of amazing things and will continue to power a lot of amazing things into the future. But it also has some downsides. And I guess my example of that would be that you all have now available to you at your fingertips a ton of information. And what I think is happening, and this is the example I'll use, and there's other examples, but what is happening a little bit that is making this more difficult, making the rhetoric much hotter, is that people can now self-select the information that they want. So if you're a conservative, you can go to Fox News. If you're a liberal, you can go to MSNBC. You can go to Breitbart on your phone and read whatever you want if you're a conservative. You can go to the Huffington Post if you're liberal. And what is happening a little bit that's making politics, I think, more difficult and making it harder for campaigns and politicians is, again, people are tending to go to the sources of information that reinforce their worldview. And it drives people to varying extremes. And it's really leaving out the middle. And those people are generally the most passionate, and they're the loudest. They're not necessarily the biggest number, though. Okay, the biggest number on the left and the right, both extremes, whatever your political ideology is not necessarily the biggest thing that's going on. But it's drowning out the silent majority, I think, that makes up the center right, the center left, and the center of the electorate. But the technology you have available to you now, again, it allows you, think about what you do. Whatever your worldview is, you kind of go to the place that's going to reinforce that. Well, the technology has been great because you now have more information. You can learn more about candidates. You can track them. You can keep an eye on them. You can hold them accountable. That's all wonderful. But you can also reinforce your worldview, and it can create challenges. And again, that's one example of a challenge, I'd say, that goes along with the greatness of technology that we're facing with campaigns right now.
I agree with what Todd said. Thinking about the question, I hope that this is a turning point. One of my colleagues in Senator Patty Murray's office back in 1997 was working for Senator Bill Bradley from New Jersey, and that year he was nearing the end of his time in the Senate, and he'd probably been there for 12 or 14 years at that point. And he brought some of his younger staff people in to tell them about what the Senate used to be like, and how civil it used to be, and how functional it used to be, and how much more bipartisan it was. And I think back to that, and if we could turn the clock back to the civility of 1997, we would gladly take that. We would gladly take the civility of 1997 that he was lamenting. So my concern, and Todd's question really touches on it, is we all have to make sure that we don't look back on 2016 as a better time than 2036, because I don't really know. I loved Professor Cornell's presentation, and it gives me hope that we go through these dark periods and we emerge. But I worry if there are things that are different now, and some of the things that Congressman Frost and Congressman Davis talked about, the fact that, and that Todd just talked about, the fact that we get our media from places today that reinforces our own ideology and worldview. And I think, for you young people out there, I challenge you to go to places on the internet and they can be MSNBC or Fox, or they can be farther left or farther right. But go to places that challenge your perspective and try to understand what the other side is thinking. When I was a kid, there were 3 evening news programs, CBS, NBC, and ABC, and all of America essentially united around the TV in the evening to listen to what Walter Cronkite and Howard K. Smith and the other anchors had to say, and it was a gathering point where we had a common source of information, for better or for worse. Things like birtherism would have not lasted a week in that era, because Walter Cronkite and John Chancellor and the others would have done a report on that, they would have debunked it, and it would have been gone. Today, as Congressman Davis said, crapola lives throughout the internet, and it's a real challenge to make sure that you're getting information that has at least some things can be based on ideology or whatever, but at least have to have some kernel of truth in it if it's going to advance the public dialogue, and if it's going to be a basis for how we move our country forward on policies.
So the title of our panel, it gets at the fact that there is probably, no matter what happens in a couple of weeks, a bumpy road ahead. And I want to talk about that, what's going to happen after the election and after inauguration. But before, I want to take advantage of the fact that we've got a couple of political professionals up here, and just pick your brain a little bit, maybe put you on the spot, and for that I apologize. But if you were suddenly handed the keys to your party's nominee campaign, right, what changes would you make?
I would run.
You'd crash the car.
Next question.
Or the other party's nominee.
I would run too. Next question.
Okay. All right, John. I would not run, but I'd vote for Todd.
I like that. I'd vote for John, so we're even. Anybody, third party.
We just solved the problem of incivility in America.
Right.
We obviously this is going to be the most obvious statement of the day. We have 2 seriously flawed candidates running for president, and they both obviously have their strengths, but they also have some challenges, which is why Secretary Clinton's negatives are in the mid 50s and Donald Trump's are in the high 50s or mid 60s. Well, I guess if I had the keys to Donald Trump's campaign, I would endeavor to try to keep him on message, because his message is actually a really strong message. When he isn't criticizing women who have accused him of assaulting him, when he's talking about immigration and jobs and trade deals and wars, he's scoring points, and he's gaining in the polls. I'm actually a person who, in August of 2015, thought he was going to be your nominee and a strong candidate for president, because I think he is responding to a failure of both parties to really listen to where the American people are, or to convince the American people that trade is good, that that what's happening in the world is inevitable, and that the government is doing the right things to protect the American people. American people clearly don't believe that's true, and Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders are both responses to that. Secretary Clinton's campaign, she's kind of on cruise control at this point, I guess, cruising toward Election Day. But I think her challenge governing, if she gets to that point, will be being open and transparent, and fighting against her innate urge for secrecy and paranoia, which are not a prescription for a healthy presidency. So that'd be my answer.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with a lot of John's points. I mean, I think going to the Trump, I agree. I think the big key, if you're handed the keys to Trump, is he is keeping him on message, which is nearly impossible because you are what you are. He does have a powerful message, and I agree with John. I definitely didn't see it, though, as early as John did, and maybe because I was in denial. But he has a powerful message that resonates with a lot of voters, not just right-wing Republicans, okay? There are a lot of right-wing Republicans who only support Trump because they dislike Hillary so much more. And you see that in Idaho, for example. I mean, I saw recent polling that showed Trump's unfavorability ratings were 62% in Idaho, okay? But Hillary's were 72%. So again, we know what we have here. We have two very unpopular nominees. Trump's message is very powerful, but he cannot deliver it with any discipline. His other problem is he is a damaged messenger because of the stupid, crazy, wrong things that he says on a multitudes of subjects that you're all aware of. So he loses any sort of ability to have credibility with the groups that he actually could attract because he's a damaged messenger. Hillary is, I think Hillary's run a good campaign, a good campaign for her. I think they're doing what they need to do. They're doing the best they can with what they've got. Look, she's an incredibly gifted person in the sense that she's a hard worker. She's very qualified to be president in my mind. I don't want her to be president, but I believe she could be president. That's clear. Hillary's problems are honesty and likability. People don't trust her, and people do not like her. The honesty issue, I agree with John, is that they exasperate it constantly with the fact that she has this, and I believe this comes from the candidate, not her team. I think her team is doing everything they can, and they're very good, but they just have this penchant for secrecy, and just the example of how she handled when she got sick. Hey, people get sick, that's life. Okay, it was no big deal, but the way they tried to hide that, it was so ridiculous, and that had to have come from her. I can't imagine her team advising her. All they had to do was put out, hey, she's sick, she's going to go off the trail for a couple days. Who cares what the conspiracy theorists are saying? They're going to say that anyway, and it wouldn't have been a big deal. But they just seem to not be able to handle any sort of issue with just some transparency, and that's going to be an ongoing problem for her. If she is elected president, I think it's going to be a severe problem for her. Because again, she is what she is too. And some of her, of Hillary is caused by, she's been in office a long time, not in office, but she's been in the public eye for a long time. And in fairness to her, she's taken a lot of unfair criticism and fair criticism. And I think it's created a worldview for her that pushes her towards a penchant for secrecy, which is very negative and reinforces a narrative about her that she's untrustworthy. Very difficult for her, very difficult for her team. But if I'm running her right now, the thing I would say, if I have keys to the kingdom of Hillary on this closing stretch, is don't take anything for granted, okay? Hillary still has to ensure that turnout among her key core groups is where it needs to be. Now, it appears to be headed that direction mainly because they are afraid of Donald Trump more than they like her. And that's just backed up in the data. But people generally don't like to go out and vote against something. They like to go out and vote for something. And so the danger for her is some complacency in the last 10 to 11 days where we got this in the bag, we're starting to worry about the Senate and the House, and we're starting to plan about how Joe Biden's going to be our Secretary of State. And Democratic voters don't all stay home, but the margins stay home to the point that it causes a problem for her. Now, I still think she will win. I just think her margins then become much tighter. And I do think the margin of victory potentially for Hillary is significant, because then again, if she has to deal with the fact of what happens when she wins. If she can win with a big enough margin, she puts to rest a lot of questions that will make it a lot easier for her to govern. And she just doesn't want to put this thing at peril. There is an undercurrent out there that you guys, I think, are all aware of. There is a group of people who are upset. And it's not just right-wing Republicans about whatever. There's some of that. But there's a group of voters who economically are upset. They're upset about, they feel that the American dream is slipping away from them, and that their politicians aren't doing anything for them, and they don't hear them, and they're not listening to them. And that's the Trump power. If he could do it, if he had a different messenger, I think he would be defeating Hillary Clinton big time, because the change message is much more powerful than the status quo message that Hillary has. And I think that's the lesson, I think, for a lot of politicians right now, is how do you tap into that, but how do you do it appropriately? Because I think there are some people who are doing it irresponsibly, who are trying to play on people's fear and anger and not playing to their greater aspirations. And I think that's the challenge for politicians in the future. How do you tap into that fear and genuine anger, but do it in a way that brings out the best in the American people and doesn't play to their worst? And I don't know the exact answer how to do that, but I know it's possible.
Yeah, I'll just add one other thing, and this is equally true for both campaigns. What the American people really like to vote for is hope, a message of hope. And while Donald Trump talks about making America great again, that provides some hope that can happen. It's not really a message of hope because there's so much negativity, that's tied into it in terms of, government is stupid and they don't know how to deal. It's not like, the Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, even, George W. Bush, compassionate conservatism. I mean, that there was a different path to take for America that would take us to a better future. We are not hearing that from either campaign in nearly the volume and quantity that we should be hearing it from. And both candidates, lapse into expressions of negativity, whether it's, baskets of deplorables with Secretary Clinton or, various things that Mr. Trump has said. I would hope that future campaigns are much more focused on giving the American people hope.
So Mark Cuban, I think he's still the owner of the Dallas Mavericks and billionaire from early tech kind of wave stuff. And also kind of a social gadfly, right? Pretty conservative guy, but not a quintessential, conservative Republican. He recently said in an interview that he's thought for a long time that a certain kind of candidate like Donald Trump could be successful, right? And that specifically Donald Trump was the right kind of candidate, but the wrong person to be that candidate, right? And that someone like himself, Mark Cuban, or other kinds of charismatic outsider billionaires could really have a successful path to the presidency. On the other hand, we know what Professor Clayton has shown us, that the Democrats and Republicans are very distant from one another. They're also really homogenous within their own parties. And so do you think, based on your experience, what you see with the data, do you think that there would be a path for a kind of a charismatic, maybe socially tolerant, economically conservative, independent figure to become president, whether it's Mark Cuban or Michael Bloomberg or a figure like that? Yeah, I think it's really difficult with the way it's set up for that to happen. I mean, I think that what Mark Cuban is saying is true in the sense that someone with an outsider message like a Trump that is not a damaged messenger that can make that case persuasively and with credibility without saying and doing crazy things will work. I think that's a separate observation from the question of, okay, which I think is what you're getting at, Dr. Vaughn, which is, hey, can an independent actually win the presidency or can they win? It's difficult to do when you look at the numbers and you look at the way this works. I don't know. I mean, at the end of the day, rule number one of politics is you got to secure your base. Okay, if you don't have your base, then you can't grow from that base into the middle. Now you have to do things to secure the base without losing the middle. That's always the tricky part. But the math is kind of the math, and I'm pretty skeptical about the possibilities of an independent candidate because of infrastructure. Let's take Michael Bloomberg. I mean, look, he could be very appealing to a lot of Republicans on business issues, but he would completely lose them on gun issues and on abortion. And then you're kind of left in no man's land. And by the way, he would anger Democrats on the left on his Wall Street positions. So here he is, he's angered both bases, he alienates both big chunks of maybe a third, and then where is he left? He's left in kind of no man's land. And that's what a lot of times what independent candidates find themselves in. Now, I'm not saying it's not possible under the right set of circumstances. It is possible, and a guy like Bloomberg or Cuban who have the money could definitely try to run something like that. This would have probably been the year, in my view, to try it. because I do think if you're going to do it, this is the kind of political environment and the type of year you would try to do something like that. You'd have to have a massive amount of funding to do it. And so a guy like Cuban, a guy like Bloomberg, who could self-fund, could definitely try to do it. But if they were going to do it, they'd need to do it in a year like this. I'm not quite sure how successful we'll be moving forward. And I'd also say that our two-party system has worked pretty well for a long period of time. And no matter what side of the aisle you're on, it's not really a good idea to have craziness going on either side of the party. And I think both parties have some challenges on with their bases, for their far bases. And both sides are going to have a reckoning that's going to come. There's a lot of talk about the Republicans, that there needs to be a lot more talk about the Democrats' challenges as well. I mean, you had a 72-year-old socialist who almost beat Hillary Clinton. Okay, he's a couple of turns here or there, and you have Bernie Sanders running against Donald Trump right now. That doesn't say that the Democratic Party, it's all hunky-dory over there. I mean, I know the Republicans are getting a lot of attention because of Trump and other things, but there's a lot of issues on both sides right now. And I would just say that at some point you got to be careful with that. Whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, healthy parties on both sides that have guys like Paul Ryan and whoever it might be working with someone on the Democratic side, you name whoever it is, that's a lot better than maybe somebody on the far extreme of one side working on the far extreme of the other side, because we all know the odds of somebody, getting something done with that sort of a situation. So that's just one other observation I'd add in there.
Yeah, I agree with Todd. The record, I actually worked on an independent presidential race, John Anderson, in 1980. And that was the first independent campaign to ever get on all 50 ballots. There's no track record to suggest that an independent's going to win the presidency. I think the better model is what we saw this year, which is you have a Donald Trump win the Republican nomination, or you had Arnold Schwarzenegger, emerge in California as the governor. A complete political outsider, but a forceful personality and somebody who was well known and who had the ability to capture people's imagination. So I think probably the best model is to do it from within a party, and I think both parties are vulnerable, and I don't mean that in a negative sense. That vulnerability could actually be a very good thing. Maybe it didn't work out very well this year, but
Really?
Just saying.
But I agree with you. It keeps everyone honest. There's a purpose for it in both sides of the parties, but that's right.
Yeah, and Todd mentioned Bernie Sanders, and he's exactly right. If a year ago you had placed odds on Bernie Sanders getting as close to winning the nomination as he did, and I think if you bet on Bernie, you would have done really well. The odds would have been astronomical against that. But I think there's a positive message. I think there's a positive message to be taken from both the Trump and the Sanders campaigns. From the Sanders campaign, I think it is that and I think this is especially a problem for we Democrats, we set very narrow parameters of what's doable. We love to tell our base that the range of opportunities are about this wide, and we always have to really focus on cleaning up the deficits that Todd's party creates. And
Ouch. I'll get you back later.
Yeah, I know you will. And we're like the bitter medicine party. No, I'm sorry. College tuitions are rising fast, and there's nothing we can do about it. Obamacare is the best we can do on health care. And Sanders said, why are the parameters here? If Europeans can have better health care, if Europeans can have free college education, why can't we? And, we should discuss that in this country. We shouldn't discuss the issues in a range that's this wide. We should discuss them in a range that's this wide. And I would encourage, the young people in this crowd to really take that message of Bernie's to heart. Not necessarily that he was right, and he certainly, never presented any meaningful ways of paying for things. But we also shouldn't set our
vision too low on what we can accomplish in this country.
Yeah, I want to add one quick thing on that. I agree, and I think this is also a playbook that Republicans have to get back on track with, and that is one of the biggest pieces of advice I always give candidates is that, and I don't know who said it, I think there was several people have said it, but look, elections are always about the future. And so it's really going to be about how do you outline a vision for the future. And what Republicans have to do, and we would welcome that, and we've got to get out of a little bit of this personality politics and a little bit out of this snarky social media politics and get to the core of, hey, let's have a battle on ideas. So we want to talk about the European model that the Democrats are proposing. Okay, let's talk about that. Let's compare our ideas to the Democrats' ideas, and let's have a discussion on ideas and on substantive policy. And I'm confident as a Republican that we can win those debates with voters. But where we get in trouble, and I think both parties do, is when we get off on narrow issues and it turns into personality contests or it turns into snarky stuff on social media and Twitter and everything else. So I agree with John 100%. I mean, and I would encourage you guys to demand that from your politicians. Hey, let's have a battle of ideas. And if we have a battle of ideas, that's good for the country, it's good for the parties, and me as a Republican, I welcome that. Any day of the week, I'd love to go have a discussion on ideas. That's one of the unfortunate things, and that's what I think Paul Ryan, and I'm very biased because I'm a big fan of the speaker, that's what he wants, and that's what he's trying to do. Unfortunately, all the oxygen gets sucked up in the room by a battle of other stuff. And I think that we'd welcome that. And I know Paul Ryan would welcome that. I know other Democrats would welcome that as well. That is a good thing for our country.
Yeah, if I could just add one more thought to this, and I'm sorry, we're going a little far afield from the question that was initially asked, but I think listening to Professor Cornell's analysis, the thing that concerns me is our ability to pull out of this negative era might be crippled by some changes that Congressman Davis and Congressman Frost talked about. Money in politics, Citizens United, redistricting. I mean, the fact that it is good for democracy that if the American people are angry with Democrats, that they throw them out and they lose control of the House and Senate. That's healthy. Same thing on the other side. If they're unhappy with Republicans, they switch control of the House and the Senate to Democrats. That can't happen in America today. The House doesn't have enough marginal districts for control to switch, and it isn't based on the number of votes that Democrats are going to get. As the congressman pointed out, the Democrats won a majority of votes in, I think it was 2012, nationally, but gained very few seats in the House. We have to get back to the point where our government, where the pendulum of power can swing back and forth. And this year, I think we've hit maybe not an all-time low, but a new low recently, I think, with the whole Merrick Garland Supreme Court nomination, where essentially the Senate has said, President Obama, you are a 7-year president. You no longer get to appoint a Supreme Court nominee in your last year in office. Now, no one says to, Senator Chuck Grassley in Iowa, who's the chair of the Judiciary Committee, Chuck Grassley, you are a 5-year senator. You're on the ballot this year in Iowa. The voters have not yet decided whether they're going to send you back. Therefore, give me your voting card. Your privileges, your power is suspended for your last year in office. I mean, I think that politicizing the Supreme Court, preventing the pendulum from swinging back and forth, and I would have felt the same way if this were a George Bush nominee. I was really proud of my boss, Patty Murray, for voting for Chief Justice Roberts' nomination. We can't politicize the court, and the Supreme Court plays a huge role in correcting the excesses of the political process and of the court. And so when it swings Democratic, it fixes some of the excesses of Republican courts. When it swings Republican, it does the same thing about the excesses of the Democratic courts. And, we need to preserve democracy in America. It's not, we can't take it for granted. You know, it is created by humans. It can be destroyed by humans. And we have to protect those institutions in America that really preserve our democracy.
Yeah, and I would add two things. One where I agree with John, one where I disagree with him, but and respectfully, of course. But one, I agree on the redistricting issue. One of the other issues of redistricting that has caused challenges is you have a lot of seats that are not in play, not just in general elections, but then all the action happens in the primary. And then you're playing to an even smaller base of people who turn out in those primaries. I think that's probably been talked about a little bit earlier. I got here a little bit late. But also, you know, that is just not healthy. It's not healthy, I don't believe, when 4,000 Republicans can basically try to decide the will of 220,000 Republicans by going to a convention over a primary. I also don't believe it's healthy to have closed primaries. I believe ultimately, you know, people should vote in their primaries. I mean, let people vote, and if independents want to vote in the Republican primary, they should be able to do that. And I believe that because, you know, we need independents to win. You're not going to win with just Republicans if you're a Republican, unless you're in Idaho, of course. But you know, which is great, you know, for me personally. but you know, I mean, overall, it's not a healthy thing. And again, it also drives the divisiveness of the politics on both sides. Democrats have the same thing. In very Democratic districts, it moves more liberal. In very Republican districts, it moves more and more conservative. And by the way, what are those definitions, which frustrates me a little bit? I am very, very conservative. But then you get into a situation where it's like, well, who's more conservative than who? And it's all relative. It's not relative. I'm a very conservative guy, okay? So I don't want to, you know, you won't have to get out and compare cards on this. I guess where I would disagree with John a little bit is on the Supreme Court, which, you know, I think that Senator McConnell did the right thing. I think he came out. There's historical precedent for what he did that has been done in the past, in the last year of a president's term. And basically the argument is very clear, which is, hey, we're going to have a election for president, and that president, whoever it might be, which looks like it's going to be Hillary Clinton, can appoint the next justice, and then the people have spoken. And I do think it's really clear that there is a ton of political activity that is going on in the courts right now on both sides. So both sides deserve the blame for this, but there's a lot of political activity that's going on, and it's not just our justice system, our judiciary is not just, it should be, you know, blind, but I think it's a little bit naive to think that it is, because there's a lot of problems with that. So again, I think that what Senator McConnell did was the right thing. I do agree with John that the Supreme Court and the justice and judiciary system is crucial, and it's crucial that we have it be impartial and fair and strictly interpret the Constitution of the United States and not get in the business of trying to interpret it and trying to write laws from the judiciary section. We have a check and balance system. We have 3 separate, independent, separated powers. We have a president who's the executive and a legislature who writes the laws. The president signs them into law. The judiciary is only there to interpret whether it matches the Constitution and not to legislate from the bench. And I do think that's an important issue moving forward, and something I believe very strongly in. I think Republicans believe very strongly in, and I think you're going to see a little bit more of a partisan divide on that moving forward as well.
I'll just respectfully disagree with Todd on one thing.
Can't imagine we disagree on the Supreme Court.
Well, you know, they did pick us, you know, to not completely agree on everything.
Absolutely.
The precedent is limited for this. Merrick Garland has now been a nominee for a longer period of time than any nominee in Supreme Court history. So you know, if a justice dies late in a president's last year, that's one thing. But when the justice dies early in that year, the Senate has always acted to fill that seat. And Todd's right. It's going to get filled by the new president. But silliness begets silliness. And I don't know how many of you heard what John McCain said last week, where at one point, and he's in a tough re-election race, and I think, you know, I have a lot of respect for John McCain, but he said, that the Senate will not confirm any nominee put forward by a President Clinton. And, which, I mean, where does this end? I mean, it just gets to a point where, we have 6 justices? Now, fortunately, Senator Grassley and even Senator McCain quickly stepped back from that. But we have to really make sure we don't go down a road that just takes us, to a worse and worse place in democracy. So.
And I agree with that. I think we also agree. I mean, Senator Schumer also historically said that supported basically the position that Senator McConnell had. So Senator Schumer is about to become, he will either be the majority leader or he would be the leader of the Democratic Party in the minority. And so, again, I think both sides are guilty of this issue of politicizing the Supreme Court, the judiciary, and I agree with John 100% that it needs to be something that is not. And I think the safest place to go, again, I go back to is, we need justices that strictly interpret the Constitution and do not legislate from the bench. We have legislators that we elect. We don't elect judges. So let's
Supreme Court justices anyway. We do elect judges in some places. That I know that.
Like in Idaho.
In Idaho, in fact, right now.
Right.
That's why I'm correcting myself very quickly.
And you've worked for a judicial candidate.
I have, yeah.
So want to maybe focus on the likely future for a minute. So let's say that what it seems like is going to happen happens, and the conventional wisdom holds, and Hillary Clinton in a week and a half is president-elect. She wins maybe a moderate or maybe a large victory in the Electoral College, but modest probably in the popular vote. What happens, on January 21st? What's the future look like for her? And also, what's the future look like? What's Donald Trump do, right? What does the Republican Party do? Does Trumpism continue? Does he, implode? I don't know. What happens? Do we have all day to discuss this? I don't think we do. I think you have to uncouple a few of these things.
Sure.
And by the way, it's not going to be January 20th or 21st when this starts. It's going to be whatever 1 minute right after whoever becomes the next president of the United States and the concession call comes. We hope anyway.
If it comes.
If it comes. I've opened up another Pandora's box. There's a lot of elements at play here. I think that, in my opinion, and I think John hit on this, I mean, look, the Republicans will hold the House, but they're going to lose seats. And, we don't know how many yet, probably in the range of about 15, could be more, could be a little less. We don't know, but it's clearly going to probably be in about the range of 15. Now, in all fairness, Republicans have the biggest margins they've ever had since 1932 in the House, so they were on the natural going to lose some of these districts, particularly in a presidential year, but Trump has definitely exacerbated this problem. The problem in the House is you're going to lose more moderate Republican members. It's going to make the caucus of the Republicans even more conservative, who are now complaining that Paul Ryan, of all people, is not conservative enough, which was kind of back to my earlier jibe about not being conservative enough. So there's already rumors and speculation what's going to happen with Paul Ryan, et cetera. So I don't know. I mean, that's going to be the first question in the House. How big's the margin loss? How big, what does it look like? Is anybody really able to try to take on Speaker Ryan? I think that's going to be very, very difficult, but it's possible. And again, we're just going to have to see how the margins are. Then you move over to the Senate. And again, I think the Senate right now is a toss-up, but I think it's leaning and trending towards Democrats, unfortunately, from my point of view. But I do think it remains a toss-up. You have about 6 races that are basically too close to call, and we're going to have to, we just don't know, and voter turnout's kind of all over the map. And I don't know if I'd love to have John's perspective on this because I'd love to have his insight, but right now it's really hard to see the crystal ball because it's pretty cloudy. But let's just play this out. If it's a Republican Senate, then obviously you have a Republican House, a Republican Senate, and you have Hillary Clinton as the president. If you play that scenario out, Trump and some of his supporters who don't believe the election's valid, they're going to be spun up. I mean, it's going to be, I don't know, it's going to be a very difficult environment for Hillary at that point as president if that happens. It's going to be difficult within the Republican Party in terms of maybe a battle in the House a little bit, the House and the Senate together a little bit. But also, there's a problem for Hillary. I mean, she's got a big Elizabeth Warren wing that is not a big fan of Wall Street and her closeness to Wall Street. She's got a lot of things where she's moved more towards Bernie Sanders' positions on a lot of things to try and assuage the base, but how is she going to pay for all this stuff? I mean, she's now going to be president, and she's going to have to work with at least one branch of government that's going to be Republican. And how do you pay for all this stuff? I mean, I've never seen anybody explain to me how they're going to pay for all this stuff except tax the rich, which sounds great, but doesn't work. So anyway, but my point is that it's going to be a very rocky road right away, I think, politically. If the Democrats control the Senate, you'd then say, well, she's got 2/3 of the government. The problem is you can't get anything done in the Senate without 60 votes, okay? I mean, both sides have had this problem. Democrats had this problem before. Republicans are having this problem as well. And by the way, the Senate, if we lose the Senate as Republicans, it immediately shifts to 2018 because the Senate map automatically becomes very favorable to Republicans, and the chances that Republicans can take back the Senate in 18 if they lose it this time are very high because you have the reverse problem that you have right now, or the reverse opportunity depending on which way you look at it. So again, Hillary takes over. She's got some problems in her base. She's got a House Republican caucus that has got always going to be wild, and then she's got who knows who's going to be in control of the Senate, but you really don't have control of the Senate anyway, even if the Democrats control it. So it's going to be wild on a lot of fronts, and I think you got to decouple it right away and look at it and see what happens. But I think that November, December is going to be extremely wild and fluid in politics before you even get to Inauguration Day of her becoming the President of the United States, if that actually happens. Trump becomes president, I don't know. I don't want to answer that question. Your turn, John.
There's a reason that the three of us named this the 2016 election and the bumpy road ahead. It is going to be a bumpy road. I completely agree with Todd. I don't know. Part of the question was what does Donald Trump do moving forward? And if I were in Todd's shoes, I wouldn't have answered that part of it because it's unpredictable. I mean, it's who knows? He clearly, is one of the more, attention deficit disorder candidates we've had. So, does he just decide to move on and focus on opening new hotels, which is what he really likes doing? He loves, his business career, or does he decide to spend the next 2 years making life miserable for Paul Ryan and other Republican leaders who he blames in part for his defeat, if assuming that happens? With a President Clinton, Todd is right. Even if the Democrats win control of the Senate, it's not going to be meaningful control. All it essentially will do is prevent Republicans from having committee chairs that could investigate the administration, and they'll have the House to do that. So even that's not much of an advantage for the president. And Todd's right. There, she has some problems within her base, and one of them is trade. I mean, how do you pick up the pieces of the TPP and figure out some way to move forward on that with the movement that Secretary Clinton has made on that issue over the course of this campaign, and with both parties in Congress pretty spun up against it. It's had a very difficult path to get this far along. Authorizing the president to negotiate and all that has been difficult. It's really hard to imagine that Congress is going to approve it in its current form, and I don't know how you go back and renegotiate something like that. The other thing I'll toss out there is I'm really curious of how long it takes until articles of impeachment are first filed against President Clinton. There's a part of me that thinks it'll happen on inaugural day. That might be a little bit overly pessimistic, but in her first 6 months, somebody will file articles of impeachment. And Congressman Railsback, you served on the House Judiciary Committee, in a serious time of our nation's history during the Nixon impeachment. And, that was our country's, one of our finest hours where Republicans and Democrats really came together to exercise
rarely used constitutional powers to do what was right for America. And you know, I think back at, I was in high school during that, and I think back to those times, and then I look at how it's sort of, it's just used frivolously, you know, these days, you know, by people in both parties, and so you know, I think there's going to be a lot of negativity tossed out there, and it has been said by a number of Republicans, you know, this past week, there will be no honeymoon, and I think that's probably true when you have a president elected who has 55%, you know, negative ratings. It's going to be very, very hard for her to get Republicans in Congress to work with her. She did very well at that as a U.S. Senator, and I think she has some relationships, and I think on some quiet issues, she will be able to get things done, and I think she'll be more effective at that than President Obama, because she'll be more sustained, but I think it's going to be very, very difficult.
And I would just add, I mean, on that, I mean, Hillary's challenge is, if she becomes president, is, you know, I agree with John that she probably has more of the skill set than President Obama does to work with Congress, and has shown a track record of trying to do that. But how does she do that, and where, without losing her base? Her base is very out of sync with Hillary Clinton as a candidate. I mean, again, that was witnessed by Bernie Sanders. So I think it's really hard for Hillary. I mean, because so what does she do? She wheel to some of her base issues and then try to run into a buzzsaw with what, you know, and amplify an already big problem she's got with Congress. I don't know. It's going to be interesting to see what road she decides to go. I would guess she'll go with her base, because, you know, it's a safer place probably to be politically, because she can't lose her base or she's in no man's land. If Trump were to be elected, it would, you know, the interesting thing on that would be, I have a hard time seeing a scenario where Trump gets elected and Republicans don't win the Senate. So in that scenario, obviously, one of my questions would be, if Trump were elected but Democrats won the Senate, one of his biggest problems would be appointments. In other words, getting a cabinet in place and getting a team put in place, and actually getting some people around him that could actually, you know where the levers are and how to run things. That will probably be a problem for him either way you look at it. But you know, if he becomes elected, then he, you know, how does he? And I'm just throwing this out there. You know, how does he step into an environment he has no clue about? And this is not just Trump. This is a similar problem that a lot of business people have when they come. It's a whole different ball game when you transition. And I've worked for a lot of business candidates, by the way, who I love and respect and would have been great and could have made the transition. But Trump, it's a big transition, and Trump would have to make a huge transition at a very divisive time. And he's obviously not a guy that, you know, is very good at trying to keep things, you know, calm down a little bit. So I think that'd be also another challenge for him, and maybe the understatement of the year.
So I want to welcome the audience to come up to the microphones and ask any questions that they may have. Whoever gets to the microphone first gets to go first.
I would like to get Mr. Cranny's comments on McMullen's candidacy in Idaho and other states, especially Utah.
Yeah, I mean, there's no question that Trump has a big problem with LDS voters who are, you know, are not going to leave the Republican Party. I mean, they just simply aren't, in my view anyway. So he has a big problem with LDS voters, and McMullen gives those LDS voters, not all of them, there are a chunk of LDS voters who are supporting Trump, by the way, but an overwhelming number of them are not. And so McMullen is a protest vote, and he gives them a safe place to go, because they're not going to vote for Hillary Clinton. And again, I think that's one of the unwritten stories here. It's kind of amazing to me a little bit that there's all this talk about everyone, the gotcha questions on who are Republicans going to vote for. Are you going to vote for Trump, and how do you stand by all this stuff? Well, okay, then let's spend a little time reversing the question on to Democrats. How do you support a nominee like Hillary Clinton, who is viewed as untrustworthy and unlikable? No one asks those questions. And so there are a lot of Republicans who don't want to vote for Trump but can't vote for Hillary. You reverse that, there are a lot of Democrats that don't really want to vote for Hillary but can't vote for Trump. So I think you got a similar dynamic on both sides on this issue. But your specific question on Evan McMullen is that he is a vehicle that gives Mormons a palatable place to go where they can feel proud that somebody they could vote for, and safe place to go. He's not,
I don't think he'll win Utah. I have a hard time. I think Trump will ultimately win Utah. I think the bigger story there will he'll eke it out, and McMullen might beat Hillary Clinton. I think Hillary's done a masterful job of driving this narrative, but I don't think she has any illusions that she has a chance to win Utah. And it's because she is so unliked in Utah. I mean, I've seen the numbers. I would have a hard time believing it. I would be more, I think more likely scenario is that she could finish third in Utah. And I think she'll finish second in Idaho because you have a less LDS voter block here. I mean, you have a big chunk in the eastern part of the state, obviously, and some here. But I think it will definitely be Trump who will dramatically underperform in Idaho, by the way, dramatically. And it will then be Hillary, and then it'll be Evan McMullen who'll pick up, a lot of the disaffected LDS voters and some soft Republicans who just cannot, they want a place to go. But what holds a lot of voters in Republicans in voting for Trump is their dislike for Hillary Clinton. And I would just say, though, you ought to flip it over to the Democrats and hold the same thing, because there's a lot of that going on the Democratic side, and that's not a story that's told very, very much.
Yeah, I'll just respond quickly. I heard somebody say before the first presidential debate this year that that Donald Trump was the only Republican who could lose to Hillary Clinton, and Hillary Clinton's the only Democrat who could lose to Donald Trump. And I think that is sort of the situation that we ended up in. And I think Secretary Clinton ended up being the nominee in large part because she had built up, a very, very strong base within the party over the years, and the the financial elites within the party were really unified around a Clinton candidacy very early on, and there was no oxygen left in the room for any legitimate Democrat, other than I think potentially Vice President Biden, to have entered that race. I think Governor Brown of California might have been another, but he didn't entertain that very long. So, and I think if Vice President Biden's son, Beau, hadn't passed away, there was at least a 50-50 chance, and maybe a 60-40 chance that he would have entered this race. And I regret that he wasn't in this race, because I would like to have had a more spirited primary season with more candidates than just Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton.
Professor Clayton.
Can you hear me now? Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
So let me just say, first of all, it doesn't surprise me at all that you have deep negatives for both candidates. That's exactly what you would expect in a highly polarized political system. 45% of the electorate is going to believe every bad negative thing about the other side's candidate. So and that, we've been seeing this going, negatives going up on presidential candidates for the last 20 years. So that doesn't surprise me. But I want to ask you a question about the possibility of bipartisanship after the election, because I'm more optimistic, I think, about that. And here's why. The big thing that prevents bipartisanship is when you have monolithic parties, ideologically monolithic parties. And the elephant in the room right now is both parties, they're polarized and they're divided between themselves, but they're also internally divided. There's a deep cleavage emerging in both parties, and it's around working class economic populism, nationalism. And on the Republican side, it sometimes gets tinged with ethnic nationalism. But that's dividing both parties. That's the Sanders movement, and that's the Donald Trump movement. And it seems to me that once these parties become deeply divided like that internally, there's now an incentive structure for party elites to work together, whichever side of that divide you're on. And I would expect to see some bipartisanship in areas like trade, in areas like maybe looking at minimum wage laws, areas like that could emerge. But ultimately, that division between the parties is important as the division within the parties. So,
I'll jump in first. I think the challenge, and Professor Clayton, I appreciate your being far more optimistic about that than I am, and I hope you're right. I think the challenge is
due to the demonization of the other party these days that we heard about earlier, it's going to be really hard for Republicans to work collaboratively very often with President Clinton. In the same way that it was hard for Democrats once the whole Iraq War issue exploded, for Democrats to work collaboratively with President Bush. They did to some extent, No Child Left Behind. There were some big issues that were dealt with on a bipartisan fashion. But I think that, and Congressman Davis talked about this in his talk last night, that when you have highly partisan districts, then all that a Republican House member needs to worry about is who's coming at him from his right or her right. And trust me, the quickest way to draw a primary opponent in the 2018 election is being seen as a Republican member of the House or Senate as somebody who is helping President Clinton get things done. And there's some big things that, in 20 years ago, 30 years ago, would have been easily dealt with on a bipartisan basis. Congressman Railsback, I think you'd agree with this, Obamacare being one. I mean, if you pass a national health care plan, it's in the interest of both parties to fix it at least after the initial political tussle is over. But I don't even see that being easily dealt with in the next 4 years. And as Todd referenced before, the 2018 election is going to be a bloodbath for Democrats. First of all, we have 25 seats up in the Senate, and only 9 Republicans are running for re-election. Secondly, the first off-year election for President Bill Clinton was the 1994 election. That was, in Democratic eyes, a catastrophic result. In 2010, the first off-year election for President Obama, Democrats again got wiped out, and neither of those presidents was remotely as unpopular as President Clinton will be entering office. So so there's not, because that election is looming, there's not a strong incentive for Republicans to view her first 2 years as anything other than the lead up to the 2018 election.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. I'm hopeful as well. I hope you're right as well. And I think when you look at the numbers, you can make a case for that. I think the problem is then the reality sets in that I think John just hit on very well. And that is, again, on both sides, you have members in Congress who only respond either to the right or to the left. And I do believe that group is very small, by the way. I think it's a classic example of what we say in politics is the tail wagging the dog all the time, okay? And a lot of times the tail is wagging the dog. And we see it all the time. And again, these safe districts, they're looking to the right or they're looking to the left, and it creates a huge disincentive among members who would prefer not to have a challenge, even though, in my mind, they should, because they can win. I mean, Congressman Mike Simpson is a prime example of that. He's a guy who gets things done. He had a challenge from the Club for Growth from the right, and he won by 28 points because he ran a campaign and he made his case. And he's doing a great job. And that was a prime example. But for every Mike Simpson who's willing to do what he thinks needs to be done and be bipartisan and make stuff happen and take 80% instead of waiting around for 100% that never happens and isn't interested in barking at the moon all day long and getting on CNN, but actually wants to get things done, there's a whole bunch of other members of Congress that are interested in one thing, and that's ensuring that they get reelected, and that goes on both sides. And I think that safe districts have made that more pronounced and much more difficult, and I think John outlined it very, very well. And so I don't mean to be negative. I agree with it when you look at the numbers. When you look at the numbers, and again, I saw this with the Simpson race, which I was involved in, the 2nd Congressional District of Idaho, one of the most conservative districts in the country. Mike Simpson is a conservative, okay? So only in La La Land do people try to say he's a liberal, okay? Well, he went in and ran a campaign. The silent Republican, the majority Republicans, Bill Cranny, my father, never going to a Republican Central Committee meeting. He's not going to a Tea Party meeting. He's not going to any of these meetings.
He's the silent Republican. He's the guy that is a big hardcore conservative Republican who could get fooled into voting for some of these guys who say they're not conservative enough, but he's the guy. Those numbers are overwhelmingly larger in the electorate than that small group that makes a lot of noise and goes to all these meetings and the activist group. Overwhelmingly larger. But you have to have candidates who are willing, like Mike Simpson in my view, and I'm biased here so I'm making a plug for him, but I'm not trying to do that. I'm just using him as one example because there are others. A guy like Mike Simpson who has courage and says, hey, I'm going to stand up. I'm going to be a leader. I'm going to be a congressman. And I'm going to represent the majority of my district, majority of Republicans, super majority of them, who want to see things happen, want to see things get done, and who know that Mike Simpson is plenty conservative for them. And that's what you got to have. We got to have more of that. But I'm worried that John is right, that you're going to, it makes it difficult because a lot of members are not going to do that. And I've seen that time and time again. For every Mike Simpson, there's a whole host of others that are just going to look to make sure they can protect their reelection. And the safe political play as a consultant and operating them is then don't do anything to invite a primary challenge, because anything can happen when it happens. And we got to have more members step up and say, I'm willing to do what is right versus worrying about reelection. We have time for one last question for sure.
Okay. So it's been mentioned repeatedly, excuse me. It's been mentioned a lot that the favorability or the unfavorability ratings are high for both candidates, but it's been shown in every time Hillary Clinton has run for a position, and this is unique to her, that, as compared to other politicians, that her unfavorability rating, it fluctuates a lot more drastically between when she's actually running and when she holds a position. So I'm just wondering why either of you think that this would be a different situation than it has been in the past, where her unfavorability ratings have dropped quite a bit once she actually has had a position, or once she's actually holding a position in office.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think there's a really good answer for that. And in my view, and I'd love to have John's thoughts on this, and is that I think a lot of people have a built-in thought about Hillary because she's been in public life for a long period of time. So some of her unfavorability ratings are just there, and they're unfair, and they're there because she's been around a long time. And I know, once she became a U.S. Senator, then the reason why her favorability ratings will go up or improve, her net, fave unfave, is because she can then go do the job, which she did a very good job as a senator and representing her New York. And did a nice job. She reached across the aisle. She did some, varying different things that then when she was able to do the job, not running for re-election with the perceptions that were there, or running for election, she then was able to improve her fave unfave. We see that all the time because she went out and was effective. And she did that as Secretary of State. Some think she was effective, some think she wasn't, like me, but many did. And she then also was able to improve her fave unfaves in that regard. The reason why I think this is different is because being the Secretary of State, being a senator from New York, you have ability to control a lot more things and be more tangible and relevant, at least to the audiences you're talking to. You step in and become President of the United States, you're the focal point of everything. A lot harder. It's going to be, in my view, a lot harder for her because of the perceptions that voters have, because then she's the President of the United States, and she already has a group of people never going to like her, right? Then she has a group of people that are leaning towards not liking her, but then she's the president. And she steps into a political environment that's very difficult for her to actually move the needle. Now, if she could move the needle, she can move her numbers. But I think it's going to be difficult for her to move the needle, whereas before, as a senator, as a Secretary of State, she could go off kind of under the radar, work really hard, have some concrete actions that improved her numbers. And I'm not saying she can't do it. I'm saying the difference is I think it will be difficult as president because of some of the things we talked about a little bit earlier, but not impossible. But it's going to be, I think, difficult for her.
Yeah,
and any president, by the way. And I would go back to one quick point before John goes. I agree. We're seeing this. It's not just Hillary and Trump, although they've helped exacerbate this. You're going to see all the candidates who run for president, I think, in the future have much, much higher negatives. That's a challenge because of the environment we live in, the social media environment we live in. And that's also a bad thing for us because it's going to discourage a lot of good people from running for office who don't want to go through and put up with it.
Yeah. I agree. I'll mostly just add on to what Todd said, although I will
disagree a little bit with what Todd just finished with and what the professor had said earlier. I think that the unique characteristics of Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton makes their negatives 15 to 20%, maybe higher, maybe 25% higher than a Joe Biden would have been, or a Mike Pence, if Mike Pence were at the top of the ticket rather than.
That's a fair point, I agree.
You know, I mean, they exacerbate their negativity with things that are sometimes their fault, sometimes not, but.
Maybe Trump's fault, Hillary's not, if you want to, depending on what view you're looking at, or both, actually.
Yeah, you know, and a lot of friends of mine who are very strong supporters of Secretary Clinton are really concerned that there's a gender disparity, that a lot of the negativity sticks to her more strongly than it would a male candidate. And I think it is hard. It's really hard. Having worked for a woman U.S. Senator, it's really hard being, it's different. It's very different being a woman candidate than a male candidate. And I think that's part of the challenge. I think the other part of the challenge is that, you know, Secretary Clinton is I think a terrific elected official, a terrific government official. She's not a good candidate. And I think, you know, I sometimes contrast her and Bill. And, you know, Bill, he was very Teflon, and she's very much the opposite. You know, problems seem to bounce off of him, problems of his own creation. But part of it was that Bill Clinton expressed the view that he really liked everybody. That, I mean, there was a reason his nickname was Bubba. He, you know, you could be a racist, you could be a homophobe, he still wanted your vote, and he still would embrace you and do everything he could to win you over. You know, whereas Secretary Clinton, you know, with her basket of deplorables comment, I think reveals a very different mindset about the American public. You know, Bill Clinton was critical of his opponents, but never the American people. I think Secretary Clinton is not as embracing of everybody, and she's more judgmental, and people pick up on that.
And I would add, just, and then we got to wrap up, that to John's point, Hillary's at a disadvantage too. I mean, Bill Clinton was a once in a generation, and you know, you look at our presidents, not all of them are this way, but Barack Obama, even George W. Bush had his strengths, even though many of you may not like him. But you look at these guys, they all have something that's just this it factor. And Bill Clinton had it. He was I mean, my father voted for him for president of the United States twice. He's a Republican. He thought he was full of it and loved every word he said. He has a gift. I mean, Bill Clinton's gifted. We know that. He's one of our most gifted politicians. But that also makes it a challenging situation for Hillary to be in. She's got her husband who's been the president, who's very gifted, and she is a heads down grinder. But that's just not her thing. But it's exasperated by the fact that we expect her, and I think the gender issue that John brought up is a very valid point, absolutely right. But then it's amplified by the fact that her husband's Bill Clinton, because he's such a gifted campaigner, that the difference between the two, it's just so pronounced. And you know, and by the way, that's not Hillary's fault. That's just kind of a, you know, and by the way, I would take Bill because of all the money they can raise and all the other great things that come from it. But one of the downsides of it is she has this challenge where, you know, he's the gifted one and she's the grinder. And you know, that's the story of everything, but it makes a pronounced difference and makes it even more difficult, I think, for Hillary. And that, I think that also affects her likability factor. And I also think it affects her trustworthy factor as well, because she just doesn't have that gift. I mean, if you were to tell me that Bill Clinton would probably be viewed as infinitely more trustworthy than Hillary Clinton, and you, I mean, ask a Democrat who they would trust more. They would say Hillary, not Bill. But voters believe they would trust Bill more than they would Hillary. Again, Bill has that gift. Obama, and a separate conversation. President Obama doesn't have those issues of likability or trustworthiness. He's got those, but he was a transformational candidate. I mean, that was always my complaint about working for Mitt Romney. Mitt Romney's president of the United States if we didn't run against Barack Obama. Okay, but Barack Obama's once in a lifetime type candidate, and Bill Clinton, same thing. They had it. They have that it factor, and it's a big thing. We don't have that in these candidates today, but I think that, again, that makes it a little harder for Hillary.
Yeah, I agree. Thanks, John. Thanks, Todd. And thanks, Gary, for giving us this opportunity.
Yeah, it was fun. Good job. No, good job to you. That was fun. We need to do this more. We take this on the road. Yes, exactly. Exactly. You know, Frost and
This concludes our morning sessions, and for those of you who are registered for the luncheon session, it'll begin at 12:30 in the Hatch Ballroom, which is down at the end of the hall. And the luncheon address by Dr. Adler will be closed circuit on these screens, so you can watch the speaker about 12:45. I'd like to thank our conference sponsors who've been on the screen: the Idaho Statesman, Boise State Public Radio, Idaho Public Television, and Boise State University School of Public Service. Thank you.